Chapter 433. Big brother, if you hadn't stopped me, I would have taught them a lesson. Once Qin Yu and the others had completely disappeared, the man named Lu Mang spat out these words with hatred. Shut up, this is the capital, not Qing and prefecture. You'd better change your impulsive personality, or else who knows what kind of trouble you'll cause in the future. Lu Luo glared at him. Just now when they were upstairs, they had heard those people whispering to each other. Those young people all had extraordinary backgrounds, and one of them was even the grandson of the Minister of the Right. How could these two brothers afford to offend such people? Although Lu Mang's brain wasn't that good, he always listened to his big brother Lu Luo's words. Hearing this, he could only shut his mouth in embarrassment. Young Duke Qin, Qin Manor, Minister Qin. As these words floated in Lu Luo's mind, the old man holding the gong was whispering to Old Man Sunday. Not long after, the old man's face lit up, and after getting confirmation from Old Man Sun, he happily turned his head and said something to the young girl. As Li Yi walked back home, Qin Yu's strange smile still occasionally appeared in his mind. The conflict between the two had long been irreconcilable. Whether it was threatening, ignoring, or even fighting, these were all normal reactions. But Qin Yu was so calm, so unnaturally calm. Li Yi didn't think that it was because Qin Yu had thought about life in the past few months and suddenly felt that he had been a beast for the first half of his life, so he decided to turn over a new leaf and become a law-abiding citizen. This was impossible. He really couldn't understand Qin Yu's behavior. Could it be that he had encountered a maniac with multiple personalities? When Li Yi returned home, Rui and the old madam were talking in the courtyard. When she walked over, the two of them simultaneously shut their mouths. Li Yi was surprised. Was there something they couldn't let him hear? In the shade under the tree, second granduncle was lying on a rocking chair, snoring softly. Li Yi thought about it and was surprised to find that second granduncle usually slept more than he was awake. He did not know where the old man got so much sleep on a daily basis. Li Yi could not do it himself. If he slept too long, his head would hurt. Was it because his martial arts was not as good as second granduncle's? Other than him and second uncle, almost everyone else was busy. Unknowingly, there were a lot of businesses in the family. The Rui workshop, the ice-making workshop, the smoothie shop, and the brothel that was still in its infancy. All of these required people. The habit of not trusting others might have been formed when they were in the Willow Leaf village. Lao Fong and the others would do anything related to money on their own. For things like making ice, they would always keep an eye on it and not let other people interfere. The busier they were, the more excited they were. Li Yi noticed that Mrs. Fong's face was always glowing these days, especially after Zhuzi was put in charge of a shop in the city and only returned home once every few days. Mississippi Lu seemed to have nothing to do recently. There was no Wulin hero ranking in the capital, so naturally, there wouldn't be a chance for her to find someone to practice with. Bored, she sat in the courtyard and wiped her eyes with liquor. When Li Yi came in, she looked up and glanced at him, then went on with her own business. Li Xian walked in circles on the ground while looking at Li Yi, who was lying in the rocking chair and reading. Solved? Li Yi asked casually. It's done. Li Xian stopped in his tracks and nodded. He couldn't hide the surprise in his eyes. He finally couldn't help but ask, You? How did you know? Remember the saying, the experts are among the people. Li Yi stood up and put down the book, then patted Li Xian's shoulder and said. What Li Xian was doing now didn't have much technical content. In fact, with the scientific level of the Jing Kingdom and even the current world, there wasn't much technical content. The so-called high-end talents were only so-so, and even far from some of the enthusiasts among the people. The power of the people was infinite. Mobilizing the power of the whole capital was definitely much better than a few people racking their brains together. The experts are among the people. Before today, Li Xian would definitely scoff at the person who said this, but it turned out that Li Yi was right. Thinking of the problem that had been bothering him for a long time, and then thinking of the honest, bare-chested, uneducated carpenter outside the capital, his handsome face couldn't help but feel a little hot. The dignified crown prince, who had received the orthodox education of the royal family since childhood, was not even as good as an uneducated carpenter. How shameful! The problem that troubled him so much that he couldn't eat or sleep was actually only worth 10 taels of silver, and it was easily solved by a carpenter. Li Xian even wondered what the point of doing this was. More importantly, this was a wonderful method. Why didn't he think of it before? Was the gap between him and Li Yi really so big? Li Yi casually threw him a washed pear that was soaked in ice water and said, "You came to say this?" Li Xian took a bite of the pear, and his face became slightly serious. He said, "I came to tell you that Qin Yu is out." "You're out?" Li Yi didn't know what he meant by that. Li Xian explained, "After you left the capital, Qin Yu was grounded by Prime Minister Qin for half a year. He didn't step out of the Qin's mansion until a few days ago." Li Yi didn't know that there was such a thing. He was stunned for a moment and said, "I know. I just saw him today." "Today?" Li Xian looked at him in surprise and asked, "Where?" After a while, Li Xian, who understood the whole story, frowned and said, "How is that possible? This doesn't seem like Madman Qin's character." "What's Madman Qin's character like?" "He doesn't return favors and takes revenge. He won't suffer losses," Li Xian said seriously. Then he shook his head and said, "But it's also possible that Prime Minister Qin increased the restrictions on him. After all, the Qin family's decades of reputation can't be ruined by Qin Yu alone. Moreover, Prime Minister Qin has been urging Uncle Huang to support the King of Shu as the crown prince these days. All the officials in the court who disagree with him are watching him. It's impossible for Qin Yu to cause any trouble and be caught. Support the King of Shu as the crown prince." "Yes. The ancestral rule of the Li family is to pass it on to the elder and not the younger. Prime Minister Qin is a veteran of 3 dynasties and has always been a supporter of the King of Shu. The King of Shu can't get to where he is today without the support of Prime Minister Qin." Li Xian finished the pear in a few bites and said, "During the time you were not in Jingdo, many things happened. Uncle Huang's health is unwell, and the discipline of the court is not strong. Prime Minister Qin and many other officials have repeatedly remonstrated with Uncle Huang, wanting to appoint a crown prince to oversee the country. Although Uncle Huang's health has improved, there have been even more voices in court wanting to appoint a crown prince." Li Yi could understand what Prime Minister Qin and the others were doing. After all, the country couldn't be without a ruler. If the old emperor was in the prime of his life, healthy, able to eat 5 bowls of rice a day and communicate with his concubines at night, who would mention the idea of appointing a crown prince? But now the emperor was seriously ill and no one knew when he would follow the late emperor into death. Under such circumstances, what were they waiting for instead of appointing a crown prince? If the emperor suddenly passed away, the position of the East Palace would be vacant and the court would be unstable. Without a new emperor to stabilize the court, the Jing kingdom would definitely fall into chaos. This was what all the officials wanted to see. From the perspective of a small landlord in the capital of the Jing kingdom, Li Yi would certainly support the appointment of a crown prince in order to live a few more days of peace. But the problem was, the King of Shu was really annoying. Becoming enemies with the future emperor was not something to be happy about. Li Xian didn't need to worry too much. Even if the King of Shu became the emperor, he wouldn't easily touch him. But it was different for him. Li Yi was sure that if the King of Shu ascended to the throne, not only would he not have a good life, he might even have no days to live. Chapter 434. Although Prime Minister Qin is a little pedantic, he never loses his righteousness. If Qin Yu is alone, without the power of Qin's mansion, we don't have to worry too much. Looking at Li Xian's seemingly reasonable analysis, Li Yi couldn't help but ask, what about the king of Shu? What about the king of Shu? Li Xian asked doubtfully. If the king of Shu becomes the emperor, what will you do? Li Xian thought of the king of Shu and the current emperor at the same time. He hesitated for a while, shook his head and said, I don't think the king of Shu can be the emperor. Li Xian's surname was Li, but his name was not Li Chunfeng. He didn't think that one thing would not affect the other thing at all. Li Yi thought that he couldn't gamble with the future of the Li family and the Viscount's mansion with the king of Shu's generosity. It was time to make some long-term plans. Well, that's all for today. From tomorrow on, you don't have to come every day. I'll ask Princess Shanning to inform you of the specific time of the class. Li Yi stood in front of them and clapped his hands. The princes and princesses immediately dispersed. 2 hours a day could teach a lot of content. Now, these princes and princesses only needed to attend the math class. It wouldn't take long for them to grow from first graders to second graders. Li Yi felt that it was enough for them to learn up to this level. As for the deeper things, they would never need them for the rest of their lives anyway. The standard of not making mistakes when buying groceries was enough for them to use for the rest of their lives if they needed to buy their own groceries. My brother, what are you writing? Seeing that the teacher had left and Monarch Jean was still lying on the table biting the tip of his pen, a young prince ran over and asked in confusion. Shoo, don't disturb me. I'm doing math. Monarch Jean waved his hand as if shooing away a fly and continued to frown. Oh. The young prince nodded and looked at the paper on the table. My brother, you're a liar. Suddenly, as if discovering something, the young prince frowned and pointed at Monarch Jean. How did I lie to you? Monarch Jean glared at him and said, Go away, don't make trouble for me. Go play somewhere else. You're a liar. The little prince pointed at the strange symbols on the paper and said, You didn't even write a number. This is not mathematics. Hearing this, Prince Jean was stunned. He looked down at the A, B, X, and Y on the paper and sighed deeply. He touched the little prince's head and took out a booklet from under the table. He said, Xiaowen, you are still too young to understand the horror of arithmetic. Come on, let me broaden your horizons. Not long after, a certain youth walked out of the Bowen Hall with a dumbfounded expression. He stood at the entrance in a daze, his face filled with deep bewilderment. Just now, under the guidance of his imperial brother, Prince Jean, his life had undergone an inhumane subversion. Why put chickens and rabbits in the same cage? Why count their heads and feet? Isn't it boring? Have you ever considered the feelings of the chicken and rabbit? Also, why does Li Lei pursue Han Mimi? How long will it take for Li Lei to catch up with Han Mimi? How dare he molest an innocent woman? Li Lei, come out now. I'll ask the guards to break your legs. What's more, why did he pour and scoop water for the Dragon Phoenix pond? Why did he ask how long it would take for the pond to be empty? Water is very precious. A few days ago, during the drought, his imperial father warned them to save water because there were still many people who didn't have water to drink. If anyone dared to scoop up the water in the Dragon Phoenix pond, his imperial father would definitely punish them. The weather outside was a little hot, but the youth didn't feel hot at all. After shivering, he no longer felt that the mathematics he was learning was very difficult. He looked into the hall with some pity, then quickly ran away. Just as Prince Jean was scratching his ears and cheeks and sweating because of a difficult problem, in the cool morning dew hall, Princess Shanning grabbed the last piece of meat roll with her nimble hands. She proudly raised her chin at Li Yi, dipped it in the sauce that Li Yi had personally made in the jade bowl, and quickly stuffed it into her mouth. Among all the palaces in the entire imperial palace, there were only 3 that were so cool, except for the old emperor's residence. Princess Yongning's palace, Consort Yan's, Shanning's mother, palace, and the last one was Princess Emingsu Royal's morning dew hall. After class, Li Yi was dragged here by Princess Shaning. The reason was that the hot pot base made by the imperial chefs in the palace was not as authentic as his. Is there anything new in the imperial court recently? Li Yi put some vegetables into the pot and asked casually. Emingsu raised her head and looked at him in surprise. Didn't he always have no interest in these things? She was only slightly surprised for a moment, then she said, "What do you mean? Just say something." Emingsu thought for a while and said, "It's not a big deal. These days, the most discussed topic in the imperial court is that the Qi kingdom has promised great benefits. They want to exchange a large amount of wealth for the 2 cities that we have occupied. The imperial court is divided into 2 factions. Some people think that the Qi kingdom is too powerful. Although we had the upper hand last time, it's not appropriate for us to continue to be enemies. If the Qi kingdom wants to exchange salt, iron, and warhorses, it's not impossible to consider it. The other faction thinks that the 2 cities are already part of our territory, so they don't agree to the exchange." She looked up at Li Yi and asked, "What do you think?" Li Yi didn't want to change his name to Li Yuanfang. He quickly reached out and grabbed the last piece of tofu in the pot before Princess Shaning and put it in his own bowl. Then he said, "What else can I think? Let's eat and think." "How dare you eat my tofu?" Princess Shaning pretended to be angry and glared at Li Yi. "What do you mean by your tofu? It belongs to whoever got it. I put it in just now. It belongs to me. But you ate the meat I put in just now. I don't care. You ate my tofu just now, so the tofu you put in just now belongs to me." Emingsu looked at the 2 people arguing endlessly over a piece of tofu and suddenly felt a headache coming on. Only then did she realize that she had asked a useless question. Ever since the incident with Tian Fa, he had never said much about these things. It would be strange to hear any opinion from him. Li Yi looked at her and asked again, "Let's not talk about these boring things. What else is there to talk about?" Emingsu knew that the boring things he was talking about were all the affairs of the state. She shook her head and said helplessly, "When the envoy of the Qi kingdom was negotiating with my father and the court officials about the 2 cities, several people who claimed to be scholars of the Qi kingdom suddenly appeared in the capital. In the name of exchanging knowledge, they challenged the great scholars of the Jing kingdom. They involved poetry, scripture, and all kinds of miscellaneous knowledge. What happened in the end?" Li Yi was obviously much more interested in this matter. "We've lost." Li Mingzhu shook her head and said, "We've lost. We've lost completely. Prime Minister Qin lost to a nameless old man in a debate about scripture. In a fit of anger, he fell ill for 3 days. These days, he didn't even bother my father with the matter of naming the crown prince. Great scholar Wang Zhong, who is over 50 years old and is known as the poetry ghost, competed with a young man in poetry. He admitted on the spot that his poetry was inferior. Chess Saint Baiyu played 3 games with that person and lost every game." Upon hearing this, Li Yi was a little stunned. He didn't even realize that his tofu had been eaten by Princess Shaning. Only a few people from the Qi kingdom had come, but they had defeated the most powerful people of the Jing kingdom in their respective fields. This was a slap to the face. Chapter 435. After a rare victory, the morale of both the people and the imperial court of the Jing kingdom was unprecedentedly high, reaching its peak in the past 10 years. Although the move of the Qi kingdom did not cause any substantial damage to the Jing kingdom, it greatly impacted the morale and enthusiasm of the people. Moreover, this was an open and above-board exchange of knowledge. Even if the Jing kingdom lost, they could not take revenge, otherwise, they would really lose face and reputation. This time, the strength of the Qi kingdom also refreshed the understanding of the people. They were just a few nameless soldiers, but they defeated the top existences in all aspects of the Jing kingdom. What kind of background did they have? Of course, as for whether those people were nameless soldiers in the Qi kingdom, they were not the people of the Qi kingdom, so they did not know. Li Yi put a few more pieces of tofu in it. Writing poems or playing chess, if they lost, then they lost. If they were not as skilled as others, then they were not as skilled. What could they do? Moreover, the Jing kingdom had just seized 2 cities from others. How could they not allow others to come and get back at them? It was a pity that they did not see it with their own eyes that day when Prime Minister Qin fell ill from anger after debating with others. Li Yi reached out to pick up his tofu and asked casually, "Didn't they say that the imperial court is debating about the crown prince? What's the result now?" Mingsu raised her eyebrows and said, "The crown prince has always been a matter of the royal family. Since when did others have the right to tell us what to do? If not for the stability of the imperial court, father has always actively listened to the opinions of the officials and never acted arbitrarily. How could they have today's arrogance?" He did not expect Her Highness to have such a domineering side. Li Yi forgot to chew and almost got scalded by the tofu. He could not help but give her a thumbs up and said, "I increasingly feel that you have the talent to be an emperor." An emperor who was afraid of the slightest thing and indecisive might be a benevolent ruler, but it was unlikely that he would become a wise ruler. When it was time to be domineering, one should be domineering. Otherwise, what was the point of being an emperor? In this aspect, the old emperor was still lacking, even inferior to Her Highness the eldest princess. Mingzi glanced at him and said, "Don't talk nonsense. How can there be a woman in this world who can be an emperor? What's wrong with women? Are women born to be dwarfed?" Li Yi said as he fought with Princess Shining for the tofu. "Men and women are born equal. Your way of thinking is unacceptable." Princess Shining agreed with Li Yi's words very much. She nodded her head repeatedly, and the speed of her snatching became faster. In this day and age, saying that beggars and emperors were born equal would be labeled as disrespecting the emperor, but for Her Royal Highness, who had long awakened her feminist consciousness, she never thought that men were nobler than women. This is different. Mingsu looked at him and said, "Since ancient times until now, which woman, in short, women can't be emperors?" "Who said that women can't be emperors?" Li Yi wondered why this girl was so stubborn. He snatched the last piece of tofu from Princess Shaning's chopsticks and looked up at her. "Have you never heard of Wu Zetian?" "Wu Zetian?" Mingsu showed a trace of doubt on her face. After thinking for a moment, she still couldn't remember this name. She asked, "Who is Wu Zetian?" "You haven't even heard of Wu Zetian?" Li Yi suddenly realized a problem halfway through his sentence. This was a world that was completely different from the one he was familiar with. The former Tang dynasty had only existed for a few decades before it fell apart. The Eternal Emperor didn't even have time to complete his career before he died. What happened after that was very different from the Tang dynasty in the other world. The former Tang dynasty was completely defeated by the next few emperors, and Sister Wu didn't have the chance to show off the elegance of an empress. In the history books that Li Yi read, this name didn't even appear. It's nothing. After realizing this, Li Yi shook his head and said, "Strange." Mingsu looked at him and picked up her chopsticks. Li Yi and Princess Shining only saw a flash in front of their eyes. The tofu that they were fighting over just now had run into her bowl. They both rolled their eyes at her, strongly condemning and protesting against this kind of martial arts bullying. After condemning and protesting, they turned their attention to the other things in the pot. After that, the princess didn't say anything. Li Yi thought that she had already forgotten about what just happened. At a certain moment, the princess put down her jade bowl and looked at Li Yi. She asked seriously, "Who is Wu Zetian?" Li Yi suddenly felt that he was about to do something very incredible. attacking the aristocratic families, developing the imperial examinations, putting the poor in important positions, and starting the era of great governance. Mingzu looked at Li Yi. Can a female empress really achieve this? In reality, as the first female empress in history, the later generations had different opinions about her, but her achievements couldn't be denied. The dawn of China's strongest empire in thousands of years, after Emperor Gao Taizong's heroic founding and Zhengguan's rule, was finally in the hands of Emperor Xianzong and Empress Wu. It was the beginning of a prosperous era, and China had thousands of years of history. From the inside to the outside, the nation was magnificent, looking down on the world, conquering the 4 seas, and was like the sun in the sky. No matter what, as the only female empress in history, she had probably done the best that a woman could do. Mingzhu's pretty face showed a trace of confusion. She looked at Li Yi and asked, "Which dynasty and which emperor are you talking about? Why have I never heard of it?" I'm just saying. How can there be such a dynasty? Don't tell me you really believe it." Li Yi was stunned for a moment, then he stood up with a smile and said, "Thank you for your hospitality. I'll go back first. I'll treat you guys next time if there's a chance." Okay. Princess Shanning's little face showed a smile, and she immediately became happy. She ran out while shouting, "Don't leave in a hurry. Tell me clearly when you'll treat us." Looking at Yongning, who was shouting and running out with Li Yi, Mingzu withdrew her gaze and fell into deep thought while facing the fire in front of her. The aristocratic families were flourishing, and they deeply penetrated into the imperial court. In order to get rid of the aristocratic politics, father had been intentionally putting the poor in important positions for so many years, but it didn't achieve much. The dynasty that Li Yi mentioned just now was no different from the Jing kingdom on this point. However, the great achievements that the previous emperors of the Jing kingdom and the previous dynasties couldn't achieve, how did that woman do it? She knew how she did it. This was because Li Yi had already explained everything in great detail. Wu Zetian, in the 6th month of the 2nd year of Jing He, Princess Royal Highness stood at the door of the Morning Dew Hall and said this name when the warm morning sun jumped out from the top of the palace opposite. Chapter 436. Ideals were often full, but the reality was much crueler and crueler. Wu Zetian was famous not because she was an empress, but because she was the only empress in Huaxia for thousands of years. Honestly speaking, if the princess could imitate her, Li Yi would definitely agree with her. But the problem was that it was useless for him to agree alone. For a woman to proclaim herself as an empress, it was not just the civil and military officials who opposed it. All of the common people in the world would not agree to it either. Wu Zetian had spent decades to complete this magnificent feat, and there were many complicated things involved. Her success could not be replicated, otherwise, why would there only be one female empress in the past few thousand years? He could not count on the princess. He only hoped that the old emperor could hold on for 2 more years. The throne should not belong to the king of Shu. For the past 20 years, Li Yi had never thought that there would be a day where he would have to worry about who would be the next emperor. It's boring to be a human. Throwing those complicated thoughts out of his mind, he suddenly felt tired. Now he just wanted to go home and have a good sleep in bed. However, it was not so easy to realize the wish of going home to sleep, which was not a wish at all. "Mr. Li, please wait." Just as Li Yi was walking with his head down, a voice suddenly came from behind. Li Xian, the king of Shu, was not living a good life these days. Of course, it was not because he was worried about his father's health and became thinner and thinner, nor was it because the internal and foreign affairs of the Jing kingdom were at a delicate juncture. He cared about the world and the affairs of the country. This was because the censor named Wansu was a bastard from head to toe. He had the audacity to accuse Wansu of not behaving properly during his father's illness when so many ministers were urging him to be the crown prince. Li Xian dared to say with his conscience that he had not behaved impolitely. He had been to the prince's mansion as usual, eating and drinking as usual, not once more or less. How could this be considered impoliteness? That bastard named Wan Su had revealed this matter when Prime Minister Qin had praised him as a rare talent in the heavens, a peerless talent in the mortal world, and a good candidate to become the crown prince. It was said that Prime Minister Qin's face had darkened at that time. Later on, Prime Minister Qin had specially paid a visit to Wan Su twice, but he had been blocked at the door. He hadn't even stepped into the Qin manor. The once-in-a-lifetime opportunity was ruined by Wan Su. The king of Shu wanted to cut him into pieces, but he could only think about it. The imperial censors were all bastards that could not be provoked. Li Xian was one of them, and so was Wan Su. Putting aside the fact that he was only the king of Shu, even if he became the emperor in the future, he would not be able to casually touch those people. As an upright official, they were the most upright and plain-spoken. They would pick on this and that all day long. They would not even let the emperor off. They would even wish for the emperor to chop off their heads. That way, they would be able to leave their names in history and be remembered for generations to come. Censors had never been killed since the beginning of the Jing kingdom. Had better not. If one did not want to be known as a tyrant in the future, he would be. Not. The king of Shu came to the palace this time to play the role of a filial son. He had already left a bad impression on the emperor, so he had to be more attentive to his father and make his presence known. Otherwise, he would not know how to explain to Prime Minister Qin. The court had not ended yet. Recently, because of the problem of the two cities of the Qi kingdom, the officials could not reach a consensus and were in a deadlock. Therefore, the morning court often ended very late. If the morning court did not end, his father would not come out. The king of Shu had to wait here for a while. He didn't wait for the court to end, but an unexpected person arrived. "County Li, please wait a moment." The king of Shu looked at Li Yi's back and suddenly spoke when he saw Li Yi walking past him, seemingly ignoring his existence. Hearing the voice coming from behind, Li Yi turned around. When he saw a figure standing there, he was stunned. Then he cupped his hands and said, "Your Highness, what's the matter?" "It's nothing important." The king of Shu took a step forward and said with a smile, "I haven't seen County Li since the last time we parted in the prince's mansion. I have been feeling guilty for not being able to apologize to County Li in person." "Apologize?" Li Yi looked at the king of Shu and did not know what he was up to. Or did he take the wrong medicine in the morning? "Last time, I did not figure out the cause of the matter and made County Li feel wronged." The king of Shu actually cupped his hands and bowed slightly to Li Yi. With his identity and status, it was very rare for him to do such a thing. "Your Highness, you are exaggerating. I don't remember what happened last time." No matter what the king of Shu was up to, Li Yi still remembered clearly how ruthless the king of Shu was last time. However, it was not good for him to fall out with him, so he said calmly. The king of Shu could not help but twitch the corner of his mouth. "You don't remember. You didn't remember. You even beat Qin Yu so hard the next day. When I went to the Qin's mansion to see him, I almost did not recognize that the swollen pig head was Duke Qin." However, what the king of Shu cared about was not the pig head Duke Qin, but Li Yi, who caused all this. However, the king of Shu acted as if nothing had happened. Later, according to the county captain who went to the county mansion to arrest him, County Li actually had the token of the secret intelligence office. The moment he learned this news, the king of Shu realized that he had underestimated his father's regard for County Li. The emperor was even willing to give him the token of the secret intelligence office, which could be said to be a great favor. The king of Shu was smart because he knew that his father was very smart, which could often save him a lot of trouble. He did have some grievances with Li Yi, but in the face of certain things, these grievances were not worth mentioning at all. The king of Shu believed that County Li should also understand this. What's more, he had done the best he could just now. The king of Shu, the future emperor, had apologized to him personally. What else did he want? After showing his attitude, the king of Shu did not continue the topic just now. He looked at Li Yi and said with a smile, "Recently, the officials in the court have been arguing against the crown prince. County Li is highly regarded by my father. What do you think of this?" This was a naked test, or rather, a cozying up. County Li was also a smart person, so he would definitely understand what he meant. "What do you think?" Li Yi said in surprise, "I'm not in the court, so I naturally can't see or hear what happens in the court." "Your Highness, I'm afraid you've asked the wrong person." The king of Shu looked straight at Li Yi, and the smile on his face gradually disappeared. Some things were very clear without saying, but everyone could understand. The king of Shu also understood what Li Yi said just now. He looked at Li Yi expressionlessly and said, "County Li, are you really not willing to help me?" The king of Shu's expression was cold, and the surprise on Li Yi's face gradually disappeared. Chapter 437. Since ancient times, those who achieved great things had many qualities, but none of them included what the king of Shu had displayed. That day at the king of Shu's residence, if not for Li Xian's appearance and the king of Shu's favoritism, things would definitely have gone out of control. Even Li Yi himself wouldn't have been able to control it. It could be said that after that day, although their relationship wasn't as bad as it was with Qin Yu, they wouldn't pretend that nothing had happened. He was fickle and two-faced. Not only could one not be friends with such a person, it was even more impossible for one to be a king and a minister. Before this, there were rumors that the king of Shu was talented in both literature and martial arts, had outstanding intelligence, and was easy to make friends with, but it was all bullshit. However, such a person with low IQ and EQ was the son of the imperial concubine, the eldest son of the current emperor, and the first in line to succeed the throne, and this successor had just completely fallen out with him. Thinking about it, he hadn't offended anyone at the start. This feud was too unjust. "Oh, it's actually you." A rough voice suddenly came from the side. As soon as Li Yi turned his head, his shoulder was patted heavily twice. An old man glared at him and said angrily, "You brat, you really don't know the rules. I heard that the ice-making workshops in the capital are run by your family. You don't know how to give gifts to your elders during the festive season. I won't reprimand you, but it's such a hot day and you don't even know how to look at it. I have to wait 3 days to buy a few pieces of ice from your shop. I'm telling you, I won't even wait a day. If you don't deliver the ice today, I'll personally come and tear down your shop." When the court ended, the first few officials who walked out of the hall saw the scene in front of them and found it funny. They didn't know which unlucky fellow had caught the eye of this unreasonable old General Shui. They were probably in big trouble now. At this moment, one of the officials suddenly walked out of the crowd and walked in front of old General Shui. He bowed and said, "I don't know how my nephew has offended old General Shui. I apologize on his behalf. I hope old General Shui won't blame me. Go, this has nothing to do with you." Old General Shui waved his hand at Li Mingze and said impatiently. Suddenly, he seemed to have discovered something. He turned his head and looked at the king of Shu. He pretended to be surprised and said, "Hey, isn't this the king of Shu? When did you come?" The king of Shu cursed in his heart. Just now, he had clearly walked past him, but he had ignored him. Yet, he was so familiar with Li Yi, and now he was questioning him. At the same time, he was surprised. This Li Yi. When did he become so familiar with old General Shui? Although old General Shui Wanqing was old, his reputation in the family of generals was unparalleled. Even the newly promoted fierce General Su Dingyuan couldn't compare to him. Old General Shui and the family of generals had always been his targets, but he hadn't succeeded yet. Seeing that old General Shui, who usually ignored him, was actually treating Li Yi so warmly, the king of Shu felt a little upset. No matter how upset he was, he still forced a smile and said to old General Shui with cupped fists, "Li Xian pays his respects to old General Shui." Shui Wanqing just nodded to the king of Shu and looked at Li Yi again. He said loudly, "Did you hear what I said just now?" Li Yi was sure that although he had met old General Shui once, their relationship wasn't so deep that old General Shui would offend the king of Shu to help him out of trouble. Thinking of what he had said to the old generals in the hall that day, Li Yi felt moved. He had thought that they were just saying it casually and had not expected that he would actually do it. He bowed to old General Shui and said, "This junior understands." Another old man walked over with a smile and said, "Hee, I can't let you, old fart Shui, take all the benefits. My children are always making a ruckus. Little fellow, when you give the ice to old fart Shui, don't forget to bring my share as well. I'll be paying for it." "Nonsense, Zhang, did I say that I won't pay?" Old General Shui was furious and glared at the old man. "Why is Sir Zhang also following?" The surrounding officials were all surprised to see this scene. Old General Shui was famous for being a dissolute old man in the imperial court. It wasn't strange for him to do strange things. However, although Sir Zhang was also a general, he had always been calm. Why was he playing with old General Shui this time? Assistant Minister Li Mingze of the Ministry of Personnel stood still with a stunned expression. Things seemed to be a little different from what he had imagined. "You two old men, how can you leave me out of such a good thing? In that case, this old man will have to join in as well." Seeing a few more old generals standing up with a smile, even great General Su Dingyuan stood up. The expressions on the faces of the surrounding officials were somewhat indescribable. It was said that a general's family was united, and it was indeed true. They even bullied someone together. What did Assistant Minister Li's nephew do in his previous life to be targeted by so many old generals? However, there were naturally smart people among the officials. At this moment, many of them looked at the king of Shu and then at the young man who was surrounded by a few old generals with a thoughtful expression. "Move aside, how old are you? How dare you call yourself old man in front of me?" Old General Shui waved his hand impatiently at Su Dingyuan, causing the crowd to tremble. In the entire Jing kingdom, there was no one else who dared to speak to General Su like this except for him. "Disperse, disperse. What are you all doing here? Are you waiting for me to treat you to a meal?" Old General Shui's words caused the crowd to disperse in an uproar. In the entire imperial court, no one dared to ask old General Shui to treat them to a meal, unless they were tired of living. The king of Shu also left. The moment he turned around, his face turned completely gloomy. He realized that he was wrong again. Who exactly was this Li Yi to be able to make so many old generals stand out without any fear of him? He even felt a little regretful. Perhaps, he had already made a mistake that day in the king's residence. After the king of Shu and the officials had dispersed, the frivolous expression on old General Shui's face gradually disappeared. He looked at Li Yi and asked seriously, "Do you have a feud with the king of Shu?" "Thank you, generals, for your help just now." Li Yi did not answer directly. Instead, he bowed respectfully to the old generals. He did not have a deep relationship with these old generals, but they were willing to stand out at that moment and declare their stand in front of the king of Shu and the officials. This was a huge favor. If you can avoid offending the king of Shu, it's best not to. Old General Shui looked at him deeply and said. After saying that, he seemed to have thought of something and laughed again. He patted Li Yi's shoulder again and said, "Don't worry, before the few of us old fellows enter our coffins, we can still protect you for a period of time." After the old generals left, Li Yi did not feel happy because he suddenly had such a strong backer. Ever since the inexplicable invitation to the king of Shu's residence a few months ago, he seemed to have been involved in a matter that he did not want to be involved in at all. The old emperor's unfathomable thoughts, the crazy and perverted little Duke Qin, the king of Shu who was already in the late stages of paranoia. How good would it be to have a simple life? Why did there have to be so many troublesome matters? A trace of fatigue surged from the bottom of his heart, and his mind was in a mess. Unknowingly, he walked out of the palace gate. He did not even see the carriage of the Viscount's residence, nor did he see the sword-carrying lady standing beside the carriage. Chapter 438. Second Miss, seeing that their Lord Jew walked straight past the carriage without even looking at them, a guard driving the carriage showed a little surprise on his face. He looked at the woman holding the sword and said. A trace of doubt also appeared on Mississippi Lou's face. Then she waved her hand and said, "Follow me slowly." Li walked slowly along the street and gradually walked out of the city gate. There was always a figure following him more than 10 feet behind him. Mississippi Lou's expression changed from confusion and surprise at the beginning to worry. Because he had been like this for a whole hour. Mississippi Lou's expression began to become a little solemn. This Li made her feel very unfamiliar, even more unfamiliar than the Li who said, "I say, get off," to her on the arena of the brothel in Qing and Prefecture. Viscount's mansion. In the shade of a big tree at the entrance, old Fong sat beside a short table with his legs crossed. He was chatting with Butler Li casually. His lips were curled up and his face was full of smiles. The word happy was almost written on his face. Is there anything happy today? Steward Li picked up a few side dishes with his chopsticks and took a sip of wine. He narrowed his eyes comfortably and looked at Fong. Ah, no, no. Fong waved his hand and took a big gulp of wine. He laughed and said, "What can I be happy about?" Steward Li shook his head. His expression was so obvious that even the dog that stuck out its tongue on the side could see that he was in a good mood. Fong picked up a few pieces of meat and looked up to see a figure coming from a distance. He suddenly stood up from the stool, strode over and said, "Young master, guess what I saw in the city today?" That group of Jade Courtyard, young master, young master. Fong looked confusedly at Li Yi, who didn't even pay attention to him and walked straight into the mansion. For a moment, he was a little confused, so much so that he even forgot something that made him excited until now. When he looked back, the carriage of Viscount's mansion was actually following behind. He wondered why the young master would walk back by himself without even sitting in the carriage. Until he saw Second Miss, who also didn't look very good, came over, a hint of understanding appeared on his face. "Second Miss, did you quarrel with the young master again?" When Mississippi Lou walked past him, Fong couldn't help but ask tentatively. As soon as the words came out of his mouth, he felt that it was inappropriate. He raised his head and saw the cold eyes of Second Miss Lou. He immediately shivered and reacted faster than the dog lying on the ground with its tongue sticking out. In an instant, he disappeared. Young master. Xiao Huan was washing the 2 clothes that Li Yi changed out of yesterday in the corridor. Seeing him coming in from outside, she immediately raised her little face. Rui came out from inside, looked at him and said with a smile, "You're back, husband. Have you eaten? If not, I'll immediately tell the kitchen to make it." "I have eaten," Li Yi said in a low voice, then walked into the room and said, "I'm a little tired, I'll sleep for a while. If there's nothing, don't let anyone disturb me." A trace of doubt appeared on Rui's face, but she still nodded. Xiao Huan washed her hands and ran in. As she made the bed, she muttered in a low voice. This year's Chinese Valentine's Day, she must ask Uncle Fong and the others to help build a smart building that was taller than last year's. These days, several servant girls in the mansion have been talking about how tall the smart buildings of the rich families in the capital were. She must not be inferior to them. Is Chinese Valentine's Day coming soon? Li Yi took off his outer clothes and murmured. He looked at the servant girl and asked, "What day is it today?" The servant girl counted with her fingers, and after a while said, "June 18th, hearing this number, Li Yi was startled. After a long time, he sighed, and then a weak voice came over. June 18th, it's been a whole year. After Xiao Huan closed the door, she stood at the door and listened for a while. She didn't hear any other movements inside. She murmured in a low voice with some doubt, "What a year, did anything happen today?" In the courtyard, Rui looked at Mississippi Lu and asked in confusion. "I don't know." Mississippi Lu shook her head. She didn't enter the palace with Li Yi today. After he came out, he became like this. She had no idea what happened. Rui didn't ask anymore, but when she looked at the tightly shut door, her face couldn't help but show some worry. Not knowing why, after coming out of the palace, Li Yi felt especially tired, especially after hearing Xiao Huan talk about today. This kind of tiredness was not only physical, but also psychological. Lying comfortably on the bed, the double tiredness was released. He just wanted to sleep like this until the end of time. Sensing that the atmosphere in the residence wasn't right, the servant girls and servants in the Viscount's residence were especially careful these days. There were no more maids discussing how the residents would spend the double seventh festival half a month later. Lord Zhu had not stepped out of that courtyard for a few days. Miss Xiao Huan's face was filled with worry. Second Miss never had a good look on her face. Even Foreign's face occasionally had a trace of worry. The servant girls and servants worked quietly, for fear of making the slightest sound. Lying on the bed, Li looked a little haggard. In fact, he had slept enough these days, but he still felt very tired. Ever since that special day, the negative emotions hidden somewhere in his body suddenly erupted. Other than sleeping, he felt that everything else was tasteless. But even if he fell asleep, it wasn't peaceful. There would always be some strange things in his mind. One moment, he was wearing an ancient costume and sitting in a bus, greeted by the surprised and scrutinizing eyes of the people on the bus. The next moment, he was wearing an Adidas sportswear and standing in the court with headphones plugged into his ears. The song in the headphones was Jay Chou's Back to the Past, and the person sitting on the throne above him was the King of Shu, who was looking at him with a sarcastic gaze. Then, he would hear his mother's long-lost nagging. Once, when he was forced to marry, he found a woman on the street and brought her home. The woman looked the same as Rui. Similar images and pictures often appeared in his mind. Sometimes, he was lying on the rocking chair in the Willow Leaf Village, the little servant girl massaging his shoulders behind him, Mississippi Lu's graceful figure was in front of him, and he could see Rui's busy figure in the kitchen from the corner of his eye. Then, the hateful faces of Qin Yu and the King of Shu would appear at the right time. Then he would wake up, eat, and continue to feel sleepy after eating, and so on. What should we do? Son-in-law has been sleeping for 5 whole days. The little servant girl sat on a stone bench in the courtyard, her little face full of worry. Apart from sleeping very much, there was nothing abnormal about the young master. At first, she thought that the young master was sick. Later, she even invited the imperial physician from the palace, but the imperial physician couldn't tell what was wrong. He didn't even write a prescription. And he even said that the young master was the best doctor. What kind of lousy imperial physician was that? His medical skills were all lies. A figure with his hands behind his back walked out of the room, and the little servant girl hurriedly ran over. Rui, who had been waiting outside, immediately walked over and asked, "Second uncle, how is it?" The old man waved his hand and said, "This is his own demon. If he can walk out of it, it will be over. If he can't walk out of it." Before finishing his words, second uncle left the courtyard with his hands behind his back. How is this possible? My husband's martial arts are not good, how could he encounter a demon? Rui looked into the room, and her face became a little pale. Mississippi Lu's knuckles turned slightly white as she held the sword. She felt a little panic in her heart, and this panic even exceeded the Cold War between the two of them not long ago. She couldn't help but think of last year's Chinese Valentine's Day, and the side of him that she had never seen before when he was alone. so that person had always existed. That person, what was he doing in loneliness? Li Yi felt very tired. His forehead was full of sweat, and many wounds on his body were bleeding, but he still didn't put down the autumn water in his hand. This was because there were countless people in front of him, 10 Qin Yus, 8 King of Shoes, 6 Wu Yings, and countless men with scars on their faces. He slashed one at a time, until he was exhausted and fell to the ground weakly. He saw 2 Qin Yus pounce on him with a strange smile on their faces, the King of Shoes sneering behind him, and Wu Ying looking at him coldly with his sword. At this critical moment, Li Yi silently said in his heart, "Rui, Rui, follow my heart, quickly appear," and then, a figure appeared. A white and slender hand held the autumn water, dressed in white. One person and one sword, all eyes were filled with sword light. 1 Qin Yu fell, 2 Qin Yus fell, and all 8 King of Shoes fell. A moment later, only a standing figure was left in front of him. At this moment, the woman turned around, and with her back facing the corpses on the ground, she slowly reached out to him. Li Yi raised his hand with difficulty, held her hand tightly, and then woke up. He saw Mississippi Lu standing in front of the bed, looking at him. She held the autumn water in one hand, and he held the other hand tightly. The morning sun shone in through the window, and it was slightly dazzling. Li Yi narrowed his eyes, looked at Mississippi Lu, and said softly, "Morning." Chapter 439. When Miss Xiao Huan smiled and began to discuss Chinese Valentine's Day with them again, the maids of the Viscount's mansion knew that the crisis was over. So the dark cloud over the servants' heads slowly dissipated, and the warm sunshine shone in again. "What are you thinking about?" After breakfast, Li Yi sat on a stone bench in the yard and looked at the sky in the distance. A cold voice came from the side. "Home." Li Yi didn't look back. He just looked at the sky and said one word. Even if he had integrated into this place, there was a fact that would never change. The matter of the King of Shu was just a prelude. The real reason why he was so depressed these days was still here. Mississippi Lu frowned and said, "Didn't you just come back from Qing and Prefecture? Do you want to go back again?" Li Yi finally looked back at her with a smile on his face and said, "I can't go back." Even though he was smiling, no matter how she looked at it, Miss Lu felt that there was a deep sense of helplessness and desolation in that smile. She bit her lower lip and thought for a while. Then she said, "There is nothing good in the capital. We can go back." Li Yi knew that she wouldn't understand. Whether it was Qing and Prefecture or the capital, there was no special meaning to him. He stood up and said apologetically, "I'm sorry to have made you worry these days." Second Miss Lu glanced at him indifferently, then turned around and left. "Rui." Hearing the voice behind her, she stopped. "Thank you." She looked back at him and asked, "What is it?" "Nothing." Li Yi stood up, waved his hand, and walked into the room. Inexplicable. Mississippi Lu stood in the same place for a long time. Her face softened slightly, but she still curled her lips and said. In the palace, in the hall of diligent government, Emperor Jing put down the memorial in his hand. Looking at the mountain of political affairs that still needed to be dealt with, he let out a long breath and couldn't help feeling a little powerless. 2 hours are up. Your Majesty should rest. Changde's figure appeared behind Emperor Jing like a ghost and whispered. Jing Di had long been accustomed to his appearance. He picked up the teacup on the table to moisten his throat. He thought of something and casually asked, "How is Li Xianzi's health?" Changde bowed. It was the same as yesterday. Emperor Jing frowned and asked, "What did the imperial physician say?" Changde said, "County Magistrate Li is only drowsy. The imperial physician has not made a conclusion. He only said that he might have fallen ill from worry. As for when he will recover, it will depend on County Magistrate Li himself." Worry turning into illness. Emperor Jing was stunned for a moment, then he shook his head and said, "What does he have to worry about? Does he have more things to worry about than me?" Changde thought for a while and said, "It said that Li Xianzi and the king of Shu had a conversation that day and they parted on bad terms." King Shu. Emperor Jing thought for a while and said, "If it's just because of the king of Shu, it doesn't seem like his character. I'm afraid there are other reasons. However, Li Xianzi has been a little restless these days. Does he want me to die early?" When Emperor Jing said the second half of the sentence, his tone was a little harsh. When it came to this topic, Changde habitually kept silent. Looking at His Majesty's face, he couldn't help but think of the dispute between hundreds of officials in the court about the position of crown prince these days. A trace of sarcasm appeared in his turbid old eyes. At this moment, a eunuch came in from outside and said respectfully, "Your Majesty, the person has been brought here and is now waiting outside the palace gate. Go and see what's going on with him for me." Emperor Jing ordered Changde and then said to the eunuch, "Let him in." A moment later, when a thin young man with a trace of uneasiness on his face walked through the palace gate under the leadership of two eunuchs, Princess Xiaoning was lying on the brocade couch, feeling the cold wind and muttering something. Big liar who doesn't keep his word. He promised to cook and treat us to dinner personally. It's been a few days, but there's no news at all. But Brother Xian said that he's sick. It seems that we can't blame him. Buddha, bless him to get better soon. Ning, what are you doing? Concubine Yen came in from outside and asked in confusion when she saw her daughter kneeling on the bed with her palms folded and muttering something. Ah! A trace of panic appeared on Princess Xiaoning's face, but she quickly recovered. She jumped off the bed barefooted and ran to Concubine Yen. She hugged her and said, "I'm asking Buddha to bless my mother. Bless her to always be as young and beautiful as she is now." "Child, what are you talking about?" Just when Concubine Yen didn't know whether to laugh or cry at her daughter's words, Concubine Wei was frowning in her palace. The palace maids who served her were all careful, for fear of accidentally angering Concubine Wei. Concubine Wei asked a eunuch with a sullen face, "What's wrong with Han, recently? He's been locking himself in his room all day. What is he doing?" The eunuch knelt on the ground and trembled. He said in a trembling voice, "I don't know. His Highness Prince Jean didn't let us in at all. I only heard His Highness Prince Jean say Fong Qing and sister from outside the door. I really don't know what His Highness is doing." "Fong Qing, who is Fong Qing?" Concubine Wei frowned and muttered, "Sister. Could it be that my son was bullied by Princess Xiaoning again? No, I must go and tell His Majesty today. Concubine Yen should discipline her daughter." At this moment, somewhere in the side hall, a little fatty who had lost some weight was chewing on an ice cube. The pen in his hand was moving quickly on a piece of paper. The problems of the chicken and rabbit were now a piece of cake for him. He had figured out the problem of filling the pool with water yesterday, and he could recite the multiplication formula backwards. Although he had only solved part of the problems in the booklet in his hand, it had far surpassed the task that the teacher had given him. When the next lesson came, wouldn't his little red flower surpass that of Imperial Sister Xiaoning and laugh proudly at all his brothers and sisters? When he thought of his name appearing at the top of the list and being posted outside the Bowen Hall, Prince Jean seemed to have forgotten all his setbacks and sufferings. He gritted his teeth and turned a new page. Something very interesting awaited him there, though he could not make head or tail of it. At the same time, in the morning dew hall, Her Royal Highness threw away the sword in her hand in annoyance. An old woman with a face full of wrinkles watched from afar and shook her head helplessly. Her Royal Highness had been feeling restless these past few days. It was really not suitable for her to practice martial arts. In another palace, a small figure sat on the stone steps in front of the palace. He held a large doll in his arms and looked in the direction of the palace gate anxiously. Chapter 440. Recently, the most important thing in the imperial court was how to deal with the two cities seized from the Qi kingdom. The civil and military officials had different opinions, and even the emperor found it difficult to make a decision. In contrast, the matter of appointing a crown prince was temporarily put aside. His Majesty did not reveal any intention of appointing a crown prince even though Prime Minister Qin had made such a big fuss. The officials naturally knew what to do. After a long time, even Prime Minister Qin seemed to have temporarily given up and did not mention this matter again. Of course, it might also be because Prime Minister Qin had fallen ill from anger and had not yet recovered, so he did not attend court these days. In a spacious hall in the Qin mansion, Prime Minister Qin sat in the seat of honor. Although his face was a little pale, his complexion was generally good. It seemed that he was far from the rumors that Prime Minister Qin was inferior to the people of Qi when debating scriptures. He was so angry that he vomited 3 liters of blood on the spot and almost died. Prime Minister Qin, what should I do now? The King of Shu sat on the left side of Prime Minister Qin, looking slightly anxious. He had thought that with his identity and status, the position of crown prince was easy to obtain. All he needed was a personal edict from his father. However, the recent events had shaken his confidence. He had almost taken advantage of the right time, the right place, and the right people. As long as he took a small step forward, he would be able to sit on the position that he had dreamed of. However, in the end, the King of Shu sadly found that he seemed to be even further away from that position. Prime Minister Qin glanced at the King of Shu. For a moment, he also wondered if it was appropriate for him to be the future emperor of the Jing kingdom. He did not need him to be as wise and far-sighted as the current emperor, but he should at least be half as wise, right? However, the recent events that had happened to the King of Shu made him doubt himself. Perhaps this was the reason why the emperor had not appointed the King of Shu as the crown prince. He shook his head and suppressed this thought. He said slowly, "The empress did not give birth to a prince for his majesty. Concubine Yan also only has one daughter, Princess Shaning. Prince Jin is still young and unable to bear the responsibility. Your Highness is the son of concubine Cui and is the eldest son of his majesty. Therefore, Your Highness does not need to do anything but wait patiently." Although Prime Minister Qin's analysis was very reasonable, the King of Shu was still somewhat uncertain. The crown prince was supposed to be his, but he was still the King of Shu. Where had all the logic gone? Had it been eaten by the dogs? A trace of annoyance appeared on King Shu's face as he said, "I really don't know what father is thinking." "Watch your words, Your Highness." Prime Minister Qin's face suddenly darkened and he coldly said, "Even if you are a prince, you should not try to figure out the emperor's will. This is not something you should say." The King of Shu revealed an embarrassed expression and said, "Yes, Prime Minister Qin is right. I was rash." "Isn't this in front of Prime Minister Qin?" Prime Minister Qin's expression was still solemn as he said, "You shouldn't say that even in front of me." "Yes, yes." Prime Minister Qin was his thickish thigh. The King of Shu did not dare to put on airs in front of him and could only nod his head. A moment later, Qin Xiang watched the King of Shu walk out of the main hall. He stood up from his chair and walked to the door, letting out a long sigh. At this moment, he could not help but doubt his own perseverance again. Although the ancestral rules could not be disobeyed, was it really possible to hand over the great land of the Jing kingdom to such a person? In the past, Emperor Gaozu was so heroic that he could reverse the decline and build such a huge foundation in the chaotic times. After several generations of emperors, the Jing kingdom had become what it was today. Although the current emperor was not as domineering as Emperor Gaozu, he was a rare leader of a resurgence. These years, the politics of the Jing kingdom were clean and peaceful, all thanks to His Majesty. Even the expansion of land that generations of emperors could not achieve was miraculously completed a few days ago. It was a pity that His Majesty's health. Not only was the King of Shu not as talented as His Majesty in politics, he was also not as good as His Majesty in judging people. The current capital magistrate Dong Wenyun, Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Personnel Li Mingze, and many other juniors who shone brightly in the court and were destined to become pillars of the government in a decade or two, which one of them was not personally promoted by the emperor. It was precisely because of this that he paid much attention to Li Xianzi, who had entered his eyes recently and was highly valued by His Majesty. Even though he did not have a good impression of Li, he had already stopped judging people based on his own preferences decades ago. As the Prime Minister of a country, Qin Xiang could naturally find out things that others could not. Therefore, ever since the name Li first appeared in the records of the Ministry of Personnel, Qin Xiang knew everything that he had done. Essays, poems, mathematics, horseshoes, heavenly punishment, improved interrogation by torture, first aid in the military, making ice in summer, liquor, perfume. Qin Xiang could still remember how shocked he was when he saw these things. He immediately understood why His Majesty valued him so much and even made an exception to let him teach so many princes and princesses. It should be known that in the past, this was a special honor that only great scholars had. This was a truly talented person. He alone was comparable to countless ministers in the court. No wonder he was so favored by the emperor. His Majesty definitely wanted to train him to be the backbone of the next emperor. He was the fortune of the country. With such a person, the next emperor would probably go even further, although he himself would not be able to see it. From the perspective of the Prime Minister of a country, at that moment, Qin Xiang's dissatisfaction with Li disappeared. Then he learned of the grievances between Li, Qin Yu, and the King of Shu. The Qin family was now tied to the King of Shu. If the King of Shu did not ascend the throne, the Qin family would definitely become a thorn in the side of the new emperor and would inevitably be destroyed. If Li could be used by the King of Shu, it would be a great blessing for both the Qin family and the King of Shu. Unfortunately, that day, when he left the court, he saw Li and the King of Shu. Later, he heard that County Magistrate Li had fallen ill because of the threat from the King of Shu. It seemed that there was no room for reconciliation between the two. It's a pity. Qin Xiang sighed and said slowly. I heard that Li was frightened by your highness and fell ill. Qin Yu looked at the King of Shu indifferently and asked. The King of Shu showed some sarcasm on his face and said, When I went to see my father that day, I heard about this from the imperial physician. I only asked him a few questions, but who would have thought that he would be so timid? It seems that I overestimated him before. After that, he looked at Qin Yu and said, If you want to touch him, you'd better bear with it for some time. I don't know why my father thinks so highly of him. In the future, with your means, I'm afraid that you can play with him however you want. Qin Yu knew what the King of Shu was talking about in the future. However, every time he thought of the humiliation he had suffered in those 2 days, he wished that he could cut him into pieces. He really could not wait for that time to come. Chapter 441. If you can't cure it, you can forget about your reputation as a miracle-working doctor. At the entrance of the Viscount's mansion, a gray-haired old man was dragged in by Li Xian. Your Highness, this is a disease that even imperial physician Lu can't cure. I'm afraid I can't either. The old man looked embarrassed. A miracle-working doctor could not cure all diseases. Although he thought his medical skills were good, he dared not say that he was better than the imperial physician of this dynasty. Li Xian simply shook his head and said, I don't care about this. You find a way yourself. After all, he was a well-known miracle-working doctor. The old man swore in his heart that if it were not for the fact that he could not afford to offend the crown prince in front of him, he would have given him a big slap. Hello, child Li Xian. Xiao Huan walked out of the yard with a pile of clothes in her arms. When she saw Li Xian standing at the door, she said with a smile. Li Xian was startled when he saw this. Over the past few days, he had seen the little servant girl frowning and distressed. After a moment, he seemed to realize something and a look of joy appeared on his face. He strode into the courtyard. Long time no see. Li Yi stood in front of the stone table in the yard. When he heard the hurried footsteps behind him, he said without looking up. Li Xian was stunned for a while. Long time no see. These days, he came here several times a day and almost broke the threshold of the Viscount's mansion. Are you okay? He didn't care about this. He looked up and down at Li Yi and asked suspiciously. What can happen to me? Li Yi's eyes were still on the stone table, and then he replied. What are you looking at? It was rare for Li Yi to be so serious. Li Xian couldn't help but lean over. He thought it was something interesting, but it turned out to be a rough map of the Jing kingdom. Li Xian glanced at it and suddenly lost interest. For the past few days, he had been focused on finding the godly doctor and had put aside many of the things on hand. If that so-called divine doctor still couldn't do anything, Li Xian decided to find trouble with the king of Shu first. There were rumors in the outside world that Li Yi had fallen ill because of the king of Shu. Although Li Xian wanted to spit on those people, he still had to find the king of Shu to vent his anger first. What's so interesting about a map? Let's go, I'll take you to a good place. He shook his head, stepped forward, and grabbed Li Yi's arm. I'm not going. Li Yi waved his hand but didn't break free. As Li Xian dragged Li Yi out, he said mysteriously, Don't worry, you won't regret it. Son-in-law, where are you going? As soon as Fang stepped out of the gate of his house, he saw his son-in-law being dragged out by the crown prince. Seeing them get on the carriage, he immediately trotted after them. Not long after the carriage of the crown prince's mansion disappeared, a cloud of dust rolled over from afar. Several fast horses stopped at the entrance of the Viscount's mansion. Changde turned over and dismounted. The two guards of the Viscount's mansion bowed to him. Changde waved his hand and walked straight in. There were only two maidservants busying about in the courtyard. In the shade of a large tree in the corner, an elder was lying on a strange chair, dozing off. Changde's gaze swept across the courtyard, and he asked one of the maidservants, Where is your Lord Ju? Lord Ju went out just now. The maid was startled by the sudden strange voice in the courtyard. After coming to her senses, she hurriedly replied. Went out. Changde had a trace of doubt on his face. Didn't they say that Li Xianzi had been sleeping in bed these days and hadn't stepped out of the house? Was the news false? My husband just went out not long ago. May I ask who you are and why are you looking for him? Rui walked out of the moon gate and looked at the old man standing in the courtyard. His illness. Changde opened his mouth and said. Suddenly, his pupils shrank and a trace of surprise appeared on his old face. He raised his head to look at the woman in front of him. After a while, he calmed down and said, Has he recovered from his illness? It's no longer a big problem. Rui nodded and said. In that case, I'll take my leave. Changde said indifferently. After taking another look at the woman in front of him, he simply turned and left. Rui didn't ask for the identity of the other party. The man's voice was so feminine, so he could only be someone from the palace. Her husband was right. There were experts among the eunuchs. Even in her eyes, the old man standing in the courtyard just now didn't have any flaws. So it's like this. When Changde walked out of the door, a surprised expression appeared on his face again and he murmured in a low voice. He knew that the two women surnamed Lu who were related to Li Yi were very good at martial arts. Before this, he had only seen the second miss of the Lu family. He never expected that her elder sister, Li Yi's wife, would be so powerful. Just as he stepped out of the door, Changde suddenly stopped and his expression changed greatly. He turned his head abruptly and his robe fluttered even though there was no wind. His face was full of vigilance. In the courtyard, 2 servant girls were cleaning the courtyard. The old man lying under the tree was snoring softly. The woman just now had already disappeared. Was it an illusion? After looking a few more times, he didn't see anything unusual in the courtyard. He shook his head and turned to leave. The sound of horse hooves sounded outside and quickly disappeared. Didn't I just sleep for a few more days? What's there to worry about? This old man has slept for a lifetime. Second uncle, who was lying on the rocking chair, turned over and adjusted himself to a comfortable position. He muttered a few words and went back to sleep. Li Yi should have expected this, but he never would have imagined that the place Li Xian dragged him to was the Jade Yard. He should have known that every time Li Xian mysteriously dragged him to a place, it could only be the Jade Yard. What he didn't expect was that the capital also had a Jade Yard. Soon, he realized that things weren't so simple. Even if there was a Jade Yard in the capital, it couldn't have a madam who looked exactly the same, right? Seeing his surprised expression, Li Xian said proudly, "How is it? Doesn't it feel familiar? Like you've returned to Qing and Prefecture?" Li Yi felt a sense of familiarity with this place. After being dragged here by Li Xian so many times, it would be strange if he didn't feel familiar. Li Xian explained, "I also didn't expect that the madam would move the Jade Yard from Qing and Prefecture to the capital. The original brothel here is gone. When the crown prince came to the brothel, he always listened to music. He never called a girl into the room alone to talk about life and ideals. A 5-star brothel like the Jade Yard didn't just deal in sex. There were often talent shows on the stage in the middle. If the madam wanted to promote a girl, she would increase the frequency of her appearance. When the customers were familiar with her, her value would naturally rise." Li Xian had only dragged Li Yi over to watch the talent show to adjust his mood. After all, when he saw the familiar jadeite courtyard in Beijing, his heart was filled with excitement for a long time. Even the madam's ugly face became amiable. However, the 2 of them didn't come at the right time. The seats downstairs were all taken. There wasn't even an empty table. "Your Highness, do you want to?" a guard whispered in his ear. Li Xian waved his hand and said, "Isn't there a seat over there?" He walked to a table, looked at a young man sitting there and asked, "Brother, may I ask if we can sit here?" Chapter 442. The young man was the only one sitting at this table. The other 3 seats were empty. However, it was not common to share tables in a place like a brothel. Behind the young man stood 2 men in cyan. Seeing this, they frowned and stepped forward. When they were about to speak, the young man waved his hand at them. Then he turned back and said with a smile, "Why not?" "Thank you." Li Xian cupped his hands at him. After sitting down, he turned back to look at the young man and said, "Thank you, brother. This meal is on me. Then I should say thank you." The young man smiled. He raised the wine glass in front of him and gestured to the 2 men. Li Yi looked around and found that even the decoration here was similar to the Jade Yard in Qing and Prefecture. When he was in Qing and Prefecture, he didn't feel anything special, but now it looked very familiar. When he looked to his side, he found that something was missing. He asked in confusion, "Where's Fong?" When he went out just now, Fong had been following him. How could he disappear in the blink of an eye? One of Li Xian's guards also said in confusion, "He was here just now, forget it." Li Yi waved his hand. He was an adult, so he couldn't be lost. Although Fong looked simple and honest, he was actually as cunning as a ghost. Maybe he had gone to find an old lover of his. Places like brothels rarely moved, especially when they moved for hundreds of miles. Once they became famous in a certain place, the girls in the brothel would also have regular customers. Moving to another place meant that they had to start a new business and start over. No one knew what the result would be. Not all brothels had this kind of courage. However, the Jade Yard was different. If we didn't meet in the Jade Yard, we would meet under the moon on the Yao Tai. When these two lines spread throughout the Jing kingdom along with the goddess of Luo Shui, a brothel called the Jade Yard in Qing and Prefecture frequently appeared in people's ears. The brothel was a place where talented scholars would hang around. If there was anything more famous than a classic poem that everyone would fight to sing, it would be a dozen or so. When the Jadeite courtyard became famous throughout the Jing kingdom, the madam of the Jadeite courtyard decisively formulated a 3-year plan. Within 3 years, the Jadeite courtyard would become one of the most famous buildings in the capital. This was the dream that she had when she was still a receptionist. One day, she would let those so-called top courtesans who looked down on her see that her abilities were not only in bed. In addition to other regular services and facilities, there was also a spacious and bright room in the building. The room was pasted with the portrait of the goddess of Luo Shui, including but not limited to the Luo Shenfu, Qing Pingjiao, and other poems praising the goddess of Luo Shui, which had long been circulated among scholars for people to admire. Of course, the brothel keeper tried so hard to buy the original poem manuscript from Zhang Zumo. Even if she offered a sky-high price, Zhang Zumo didn't agree. She could only settle for the next best thing. She took out the manuscript and made a copy. Even so, the price she paid made her heart ache. Because of this, the brothel keeper didn't mutter about the heartless goddess behind her back. Speaking of which, it was strange. Ever since those things were posted, every day, there would be some strange people standing in front of those copies. They would look at them for the whole day. They didn't eat, didn't drink, and didn't let the girls accompany them. Although these people seriously disrupted the order of the brothel, they were generous. Even if she offered a price of 10 taels of silver, they would just casually throw the money bag away and not even look at her. It was as if their eyes were grown on the wall. Over time, the brothel keeper let them be. As long as they paid, they could look at it for as long as they wanted. Who is the goddess of Luo Shui? Ever since Li Xian stepped into the Jadeite courtyard, he had heard this name no less than 10 times in the short 15 minutes. He asked in confusion, since when did the Jadeite courtyard have a goddess of Luo Shui? When the title of goddess of Luo Shui was first attached to Zhang Zumo, Li Xian was no longer in Qing and Prefecture. Later, although her fame had spread to the capital, it couldn't compare to the influence in Qing and Prefecture. Therefore, this was the first time Li Xian had heard of the name of goddess of Luo Shui. The young man opposite him asked with some surprise, "Brother, you seem to be quite familiar with the Jadeite courtyard, but why don't you know of the goddess of Luo Shui?" "No." Li Xian shook his head and said, "What goddess of Luo Shui? Could it be the new top girl of the Jadeite courtyard? Where is Lady Zumo?" When Li Xian said the second half of the sentence, he looked at Li Yi. "Redeemed her," Li Yi said casually. "What?" Li Xian was shocked. He even stood up from his seat and said, "Who redeemed her?" "You redeemed her. Did your wife agree? Your second daughter agreed?" "No, I didn't see her in your house." "Could it be that you secretly redeemed her and raised her in Qing and Prefecture?" "That's not right. Didn't your family go back once some time ago?" "I don't think you have the guts." The young man opposite him was slightly stunned. He thought that it was strange that the person opposite him knew Lady Zumo but didn't know she was the goddess of Luo Shui. He was even more confused about what he had just said. Li Yi buried his head in his food and occasionally glanced at the young woman's dance on the stage. At this time, ignoring Li Xian was the right choice. Seeing that Li Yi didn't say a word and looked sad, Li Xian seemed to think of something. He sighed and said, "When we were in Qing and Prefecture, I said that you should have made a move earlier. It's not easy for a woman to talk about this kind of thing. Moreover, Lady Zumo looks weak, but she is actually very strong-willed. Now, someone else has made the first move. It's too late to regret, she redeemed herself. Li Yi finally couldn't stand it anymore. He put down his chopsticks and explained. Ah, redeemed herself. The expression on Li Xian's face was stunned. He had the preconceived idea that the woman in the brothel must have been redeemed and taken back as a house. He was still feeling sorry for Li Yi. When he suddenly heard this sentence, he swallowed all the comforting words he wanted to say. The young man next to him showed a little surprise. He had been in the capital city for several months and had heard the name of the goddess of Luo Shui many times. However, although this jade courtyard was famous because of the goddess of Luo Shui, no one had ever seen the legendary woman. Listening to the words of the two noble young men in front of him, they seemed to know her and had a close relationship with her. Crash! When Li Xian was about to ask for more details, a girl in front of him who was carrying the dishes accidentally tripped and the tray in her hand fell out of her hand. Then there was a sound of dishes breaking. One of the guests was unexpectedly hit on the head by a dish, and his whole body was drenched with juice. He looked very embarrassed. Even the young man sitting opposite them was stained with some vegetable juice. Little Red, you damn girl. Can't you watch where you are going? Quickly apologized to the guest. A brothel steward immediately walked over and scolded loudly. Damn it, you're courting death. The unfortunate man was stunned for a moment. Then he realized what had happened and immediately jumped up from his seat. He didn't care about the steward's words just now. He looked at the girl who was standing there at a loss and scolded angrily. Then he slapped her face hard. A trace of fear flashed across the girl's face, but she didn't avoid it. She just closed her eyes tightly. In the end, the man's slap didn't fall on the girl's face. A young man grabbed his wrist. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't slap her. Chapter 443. The young man looked at the enraged man and said with a smile, "This lady did not mean it. Why do you have to make things difficult for a lady? I like it. It's none of your business." After being stopped, the man's anger did not subside. Instead, he became even more furious. He struggled to break free from the hand and tried to push the young man away. Bang! At this moment, there was a sudden dull sound in the hole. Before the man's hand could touch the young man, his body drew a beautiful arc in the air and flew straight out of the door. A man in green behind the young man followed him out with a gloomy face. Thank you, young man." The young woman's expression was still a little panicked. She hurriedly bowed to the young man. "It's all right. Just be careful in the future." The young man had already taken off his outer robe and said with a smile. "Little Red, what's wrong with you? You've been here for so long, but you're still so careless." When the young woman was being reprimanded by the brothel manager, the young man cupped his hands at Li Yi and turned to leave the brothel. This guy is not bad. Li Xian glanced at the door and said to himself. Li Yi was thinking about something, so he didn't reply. Li Xian thought that he had just recovered from a serious illness. He did not talk as much as before. He only cheered along with the crowd when the performance reached its climax. The crown prince, who was well versed in the royal etiquette, completely let go of himself at this moment. After a while, when the two of them were about to leave, a steward came forward and said with a smile, "You too, that young man has already paid when he left. Didn't he have the final say?" Li Xian muttered, but he did not care. In his heart, he had a higher opinion of that young man. When they returned, they still did not see Fang. Li Yi did not ask the guards to look for him and let him be. At this moment, in the backyard of the jadeite courtyard, the young woman who had just smashed the plate was sitting on a stone bench by the wall. She looked a little sad and murmured, "Sigh, this month's allowance is gone again." Then, "Are you injured?" After a long time, a voice came from outside the wall. The girl sniffed and said happily, "No, a young master helped me block it. He seemed like a very nice person." "Oh." It was still silent for a long time before a muffled voice came from outside the wall. "It's so nice to see you again in the capital." The girl patted the wall with one hand, and the smile on her face widened. This time, a voice came from outside the wall. The man laughed but didn't say anything else. "Hey, stop. You can't go in here." The urgent voice of the Jade Courtyard steward suddenly sounded. The young girl raised her head and saw that the steward was being pushed out from the inside. The man with a few bruises on his face scanned the courtyard angrily. When he saw the woman sitting by the wall, he sneered, "So you were hiding here. How much is this chick? I'm buying her today. Let our brothers have a good time." Seeing the girl's curvaceous figure, a trace of lust appeared on the man's face. He strode over and said, "Sir, isn't Little Red?" The steward hurriedly said and was kicked to the side by the men behind the man. "If you talk again, believe it or not, I'll tear down your broken brothel." Seeing the men approaching, the girl's face showed some fear, but she still gritted her teeth and didn't say anything. The man with the bruises on his face twitched and sneered, "*TCH, I'd like to see who's going to stop me now." Just as the man finished speaking, he suddenly felt his vision go black. Something seemed to flash on the wall of the courtyard. Then, a huge shadow like a ferocious beast fell from the sky. "Where did you go?" Li Yi stood at the door and saw Fang leisurely stroll over from afar. He walked to the door and patted the dust off his body. "I didn't go anywhere. I just wandered around in the city and came back." Fang shook his head and said calmly. Li Yi glanced at him. "Your wife came to look for you just now." As soon as Li Yi finished speaking, Fang's expression changed drastically. "If your wife asks later, you'd better say you went to the perfume workshop." Li Yi kindly reminded Fang and walked back to the courtyard with his hands behind his back. He felt that he needed to discuss with second granduncle how to solve his headache after sleeping for so long. Fang stood in the courtyard and stretched out his sleeve to smell it. He nodded in agreement. He didn't know the background of the workers in the capital city, so he was a little worried. It was better to keep an eye on them. The morning court session was not early. The emperor was benevolent and considerate of his subjects. He postponed the morning court session to about 8:00 in the morning. Compared with the previous practice of waiting at the palace gate in the middle of the night and entering the palace at dawn, the emperor's action made many aged subjects or those who lived far away feel deeply grateful. Li Yi didn't feel anything about this benevolent policy because he got up before dawn. When he arrived at the palace gate, many officials were still waiting there. Although the court session was set at 8:00, the emperor was benevolent and the subjects couldn't ask for a foot after being given an inch. Just after 7:00, there were already many people waiting at the palace gate. After glancing at the crowd, a eunuch led Li Xianzi into the palace from the side door. This scene made many officials stare with their eyes wide open. Although it was summer, it was still a little cold to stand here in the morning before the sun rose. Even the prime minister was freezing here. How could Li Xianzi enter the palace like this? All the officials in the imperial court knew that Li Xianzi was favored by the emperor, but until now, they didn't know how much he was favored by the emperor. It could even be said that if Li Xianzi didn't stand on the opposite side of the king of Shu, he would have a meteoric rise and become an influential figure in the imperial court, an existence that even they had to look up to. Unfortunately, Li Xianzi was still too young. At this time, almost everyone was thinking about the rumors in the capital city in recent days. Looking at the slowly closing side door, they all had different thoughts. Although Li Mingze, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel, looked calm. There was an unconcealable worry in the depths of his eyes. Beside him, Capital Governor Dong Wenyun looked in the direction of the palace gate with an uneasy expression. Several old generals frowned and gathered together to discuss something in a low voice. On the contrary, Prime Minister Qin and the officials who were close to the King of Shu looked relaxed. Many of them even had a trace of sarcasm and ridicule on their faces. So what if he was favored by the emperor? Even if he was favored by the emperor, how long could the emperor favor him? Only Prime Minister Qin didn't have any expression on his face. None of the officials standing beside him dared to look at the Prime Minister. Of course, no one saw the trace of pity in his eyes. Li Yi didn't know what the officials outside the palace were thinking. Led by the eunuch, they came to the familiar garden after a few turns in the palace. It was the same white fungus and lotus seed soup, the same home-cooked side dishes, and the faint fragrance of grape wine. Sit. A middle-aged man wearing only an undershirt sat opposite him and stretched out his hand. Chapter 444. Why? Is today's food not to your liking? Beside the stone table in the pavilion, Jing Emperor was eating to his heart's content. At a certain moment, he looked up at Li Yi and saw him carefully chewing a mouthful of lotus seed soup for a long time. He asked, "Your Majesty has misunderstood." Li Yi put down his chopsticks and said, "It's just that I have been seriously ill these days and have not recovered yet. My appetite is not good." Jing Emperor nodded and said, "I heard from the imperial physician that you are overly worried. You might as well tell me what you are worried about. Maybe I can help you." Li Yi shook his head and said, "I dare not trouble your Majesty. It's just that there are some knots in my heart that have not been resolved. I slept at home for a few days and am much better now." Jing Emperor looked at him and did not continue on this topic. He said, "I have told you before that I will only grant you the title of nobility and not increase your official rank. It is said that a ruler does not go back on his words. But now, I really regret it." Li Yi raised his eyebrows and raised his head. Jing Emperor had already sighed and said, "I don't have much time." There was a deep unwillingness and helplessness in his words. Li Yi did not answer. A wise ruler would, of course, want to live for a few more years and see the land that was becoming richer and stronger in his hands. However, there were some things that he couldn't escape even if he was a ruler who received orders from the heavens. A few days ago, the left assistant minister of the Ministry of War resigned. "I want you to take over this position. What do you think?" Li Yi still did not know what kind of promotion it was to go from having no official position to being the left assistant minister of the Ministry of War. He also did not know how many officials in the court would oppose this decision of Emperor Jing. He also did not know how shocking it was for the emperor to ask his own opinion on the appointment of an official. He only knew that he would not be the left assistant minister of the Ministry of War no matter what. Li Yi immediately stood up, bowed, and said, "This subject thanks your Majesty for your grace, but this subject is ill, and I'm afraid it's difficult for me to take on this heavy responsibility. I'm afraid I'll fail your Majesty's expectations, and I hope your Majesty can retract your order." Emperor Jing was not surprised by Li Yi's answer. He stood up and took 2 steps forward. With his back facing Li Yi, he looked into the distance and said, "I remember the first time I saw you. It was in the garden of Prince Ning's mansion, right? At that time, I knew that you were ambitious, but your personality was lazy and you had no desire for an official career. I originally wanted you to polish yourself in the officialdom for a few years before summoning you back to the capital and entrusting you with heavy responsibilities. But even though you were far away in Qing and Fu, you still did so many things for me and for this country. But your personality, on the contrary, became more and more lazy. In one's life, one has to pursue something. Li Yi, what exactly do you want? Money or power?" Li Yi was silent and didn't speak. "I can give all of these to you. I really don't have much time. In the future, the world will be your world. I know you have great talent, and I don't want to wrong you. Now, tell me, what exactly do you want? Li Yi was silent for a while and then said, Your Majesty has given me a lot. I am already satisfied and have no other requests. The atmosphere in the pavilion sank into a long silence. After an unknown amount of time, a hoarse voice broke the silence. Changde walked forward and said in a small voice, Your Majesty, it's time for morning court. Your Majesty is so generous, but this little fellow is so evasive. In my opinion, Your Majesty only needs to give an order. Whether or not he is the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War, it doesn't matter. Looking at the middle-aged man standing in the pavilion with his hands behind his back, Changde thought for a moment and said. At this time, there were only the two of them left in the pavilion. After a long time, Emperor Jing turned his head and sighed. He said, I'm afraid he already has the intention to leave. Hearing this, Changde paused and asked, Intention to leave? To where? Emperor Jing did not answer. His eyes drifted, and the thumb and index finger of his right hand unconsciously rubbed together. He murmured, The king of Shu is incompetent, and none of my princes are of great use. If they were half as capable as county magistrate Li, I wouldn't have to worry about this. Emingsu, if Emingsu was a man, even if she. Changde closed his mouth again. The weather today was gloomy, and the sky above their heads was covered with thick black clouds. It was likely that there would be a heavy rain. After Li Yi walked out of the garden, of course, he could not hear the conversation in the pavilion. He was thinking about something. When he passed by a palace, a figure suddenly flashed out from the corner of the wall. Princess Shining pounced on him like a little tiger. She hugged his waist and said angrily, Liar, big liar. Didn't you say you would treat me to a meal? Li Yi pressed her little head and finally made her let go. He said, Lead the way, to the meal. The proud Lolita was stunned for a moment, and then a smile immediately appeared on her little face. Wait a minute, I'll go call my sister. She asked Li Yi to wait here, and ran to the morning dew hall while shouting. Ah, brother Xian is also here. Not long after, Li Xian, who was supposed to follow the officials to court, was discovered by the sharp-eyed Princess Shining. She dragged him out of the crowd. The censor's eyes almost popped out. The officials spitting and farting on the way to court would be recorded in a small notebook by them, but for Princess Shining's serious violation of the rules, he could only watch. No, he turned his head after a glance. Anyway, he couldn't do anything about it. What the eye doesn't see, the heart doesn't grieve, lest he got angry. Li Xian occasionally went to court, but he only played the role of a bystander. Just as he was worrying about how to pass the difficult morning court time, Princess Shining undoubtedly gave him a way out. No matter how you looked at it, sitting in a cool room with 8 dishes and a soup in front of you was very appetizing. No matter how you looked at it, it was much better than leaning against a pillar in the court and dozing off, right? Gulp. Li Xian couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva. Even though he had already eaten breakfast, he still felt that he could finish the big table of dishes in front of him by himself. Gulp. Princess Shining's eyes widened. The scene in front of her was even more than she had imagined. She simply couldn't wait for the others to make the first move. She picked up a piece of pork rib and started gnawing on it. The supervisor of the catering department was really crying. With tears in his eyes, he looked at the 4 people who almost wiped out all the precious ingredients. He couldn't afford to offend any of them. He was extremely suspicious of what he had done in his previous life. Today, is it some special day? Li Xian's chopsticks flew like lightning. His mouth didn't stay idle either. He looked at Li Yi while eating and asked, You guys eat? You guys eat, I've already eaten just now. Li Yi washed his hands, said to them, and walked straight out. The proud Lolita's cheeks were puffed up, and she couldn't help but nod. Right now, food was everything. It couldn't be better that no one was fighting with her. Li Emingsu looked up, and a trace of doubt appeared in her eyes. She put down her chopsticks and stood up to follow. Oh, wait. Li Xian still had a piece of pork rib in his mouth. He took 2 more pieces and hurriedly chased after them. Chapter 445. Your Majesty, the position of Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War is very important. You can't be so hasty. In the court, an old official stood in front of the crowd and said quickly with a ceremonial tablet in his hand. Emperor Jing frowned and asked, "Is there anyone else who has an objection?" As soon as he finished speaking, another official suddenly stepped forward and said loudly, "Although Li Xianzi is a talented person, he is still too young and lacks experience. He can't take on such a heavy responsibility." Many officials looked at each other and saw the deep meaning in each other's eyes. They nodded slightly. "Your Majesty, please reconsider. Your Majesty, please reconsider. Your Majesty, please reconsider." One official stood out. 2 officials stood out. After a while, the court was densely packed with people. Among those who persuaded Emperor Jing to take back his decision to appoint Li Yi as the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War, there were those who were in Prime Minister Qin's faction, but there were more who were not in the Qin faction. The Ministry of War was in charge of the military affairs of the country. There was a Minister of War and 2 assistant ministers. The Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War was a rank 4 official. His status was only lower than the Minister of War. He was an official of the imperial court. How could he be appointed so hastily? Everyone knew that His Majesty favored Li Xianzi very much. But there must be a limit to his favor. If any official of the imperial court could be appointed like this without an examination, wouldn't the great country of the Jing kingdom be finished sooner or later? This country was His Majesty's country, but it was also the country that they had worked hard to build. The officials would not allow it to be destroyed, not even His Majesty. If His Majesty insisted on acting arbitrarily, then they could only remonstrate with death. Emperor Jing knew that his decision would definitely be opposed by many people, but he didn't expect that there would be so many people. Seeing the rows of officials standing out, his face couldn't help but darken. He originally wanted to let Li Yi start from the position of county lieutenant and promote him step by step, just like how he promoted others. But when he found that time was running out, he couldn't wait for Li Yi to be able to stand alone in the court and clear the obstacles for the new emperor. Naturally, he couldn't help but be anxious. However, even though he had the absolute right to speak, he could not disregard the opinions of so many courtiers. Otherwise, the entire court would be in chaos before his death. This was not his intention. In that case, we will discuss this matter later. Dismissed. Emperor Jing was annoyed. He waved his sleeves and strode away. I really don't know what kind of person this county magistrate Li is to be treated like this by His Majesty. A middle-aged official said leisurely. Everyone nodded in agreement. Although His Majesty did not take back his order, this was already the greatest concession a ruler could make. Seeing His Majesty leave, the courtiers finally heaved a sigh of relief. At the same time, they could not help but feel a little envious and jealous of Li Xianzi. The Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War was an important position, and the Emperor actually wanted to directly promote him. If other people's favor was like rain and dew, his could probably be described as a torrential downpour. Naturally, there were also many people who were curious. What exactly did the legendary Li Xianzi have that attracted His Majesty and made His Majesty pay so much attention to him? A person who was frightened and fell ill because of a few words from the King of Shu must be timid. How capable could he be? It had to be said that Li Xianzi had appeared too frequently in their eyes recently. When the officials walked out of the hall, more than half of them were talking about him. Of course, some people were secretly delighted. The matter of the two cities of the Qi kingdom had been settled, so the court was dismissed so early today. Except for the family of generals, the courtiers seemed to be in a one-sided state about the matter of Li Xianzi, so there was nothing to discuss. If there was nothing important, the court should be dismissed so early in the next few days, right? It was really a happy thing to be able to go back and have a meal earlier. On the stone steps of a palace somewhere, a little girl was sitting there with a doll in her arms and her eyes were fixed in a certain direction. The patrolling guards in the palace came and went. Occasionally, eunuchs and palace maids passed by, but none of them could make her eyes waver. After an unknown amount of time, at a certain moment, when a familiar figure appeared in her line of sight, her eyes suddenly lit up. She stood up from the stone steps and jogged into the distance. "Your Highness, the King of Shu." The King of Shu's face was a little gloomy. He ignored the guards who saluted him. Because of his improper behavior when his father was seriously ill last time, the imperial censor could use it against him, so his reputation among the officials was greatly reduced. This morning, he was severely reprimanded by his mother for 2 hours and only came out now. He was extremely depressed. Just when the King of Shu was unable to vent his anger, a little shadow ran over from the front. The King of Shu looked up and recognized that it was his half-sister, the only silly sister of his. There had never been any kinship in the royal family. The King of Shu naturally had no feelings for Princess Yongning. He just felt that as a princess of a country, she should be so silly, which was really a disgrace to the royal family. Perhaps because she ran too fast, the little girl accidentally tripped and fell to the ground. The doll in her hands also flew out. She got up from the ground and didn't bother to pat the dust off her body or wipe the blood from her knees. Her expression was a little flustered as she looked around. The King of Shu looked at the dirty thing that had rolled to his feet and even touched the hem of his clothes with disgust. He raised his foot and stepped on it angrily. The little girl finally saw her doll. She limped over and tried to pull it out from under the King of Shu's feet. How could a 6-year-old girl compare to an adult man in terms of strength? When she realized that she couldn't pull the doll out, she raised her head and said softly, return it to me." It was said that Li Yi was very fond of this Princess Yongning. Therefore, when the King of Shu looked down, the disgust on his face deepened even though the little girl was pretty. The King of Shu looked coldly at the little girl who was begging on the ground. The vexation in his heart actually lessened a little. A cold smile appeared on his face. At some point, he finally released his foot. However, before the little girl could take the doll away, he kicked it harshly into the lotus pond at the side. When the two eunuchs behind the King of Shu saw this scene, their facial muscles twitched involuntarily. They thought to themselves, as an adult prince, how could he treat a little girl like this? No wonder His Majesty refused to pass the throne to him. His Majesty is wise. Of course, these words could only be thought in their hearts. They never dared to say it out loud. The little girl watched in a daze as the doll was kicked into the pond. As if all the strength in her body had been sucked out, she sat on the ground in a daze. 2 clouds of mist immediately appeared in her big bright eyes. She sobbed and said, "Return it to me, return my beautiful goat to me." Li Yi, who was walking over quickly, suddenly stopped. In that instant, there seemed to be countless roars of thunder in his mind. At the same time, in the distant main hall, hundreds of officials walked out one after another. In the sky above their heads, a circle of gold gradually appeared at the edge of the thick dark clouds. A ray of golden light shone through the dark clouds, followed by 10 rays, 100 rays, 1,000 rays, 10,000 rays. Behind the clouds, the long-awaited sun finally appeared. Chapter 446. The king of Shu turned his head and happened to see Li Yi stop in his tracks. He saw Li Yi's face change dramatically. Li Yi's face turned pale and his body trembled slightly, looking extremely frightened. Is this the important minister that my father valued? Is this the legendary Li Xianzi who created the national treasure? Is this the person whom the old generals protected at the risk of offending the future emperor? At this moment, the king of Shu began to doubt whether there was really a king's aura. Otherwise, why would Li Yi be so frightened at the sight of him? Li Xianzi, where are you going? The king of Shu said lightly with a sarcastic smile on his face. Li Yi's breathing was rapid and his chest was heaving up and down. If he raised his head, the king of Shu would definitely see his bloodshot eyes. He walked up to the king of Shu and punched him hard in the face. F***CKU. Plop. The king of Shu's sarcastic smile was still on his face, but his body fell to the ground. However, it was not over yet. Li Yi grabbed his collar and punched his face again and again. He didn't care even if the blood splattered on his body. King of Shu. Crown Prince. You're very arrogant, aren't you? Get up. Get up and talk to me if you have the guts. Princess Yongning sat on the ground in a daze. She looked at the scene in front of her and forgot to cry for a moment. The two eunuchs behind the king of Shu stood rooted to the ground, their faces full of astonishment. The person lying on the ground whose original face could no longer be recognized was the honorable king of Shu. And the person who punched him again and again in a crazed manner and said strange words was Li Xianzi, who was frightened by the king of Shu and fell ill. Who the hell made up this rumor? This thought flashed in the minds of the two eunuchs. They had no time to greet the ancestors of the rumormonger. If they continued to beat him, he would die. If the king of Shu died, their lives would not be far from the end. The two eunuchs hurriedly squatted down and wanted to pull Li Xianzi away. However, they were greeted with two knife hand strikes. After blacking out, they collapsed to the ground. Future Crown Prince. Proficient in both literary and military strategies. F***CKU. The usual indifference could no longer be seen on Li Yi's face. Instead, it was replaced by endless ferocity and madness. The king of Shu's reputation of being well-versed in both the pen and the sword was just a boast. At this moment, he could not break free from Li Yi's grasp at all. He was drowned in humiliation and pain. In the distance, a figure was hiding behind a certain palace, watching the scene unfold before him with endless fear on his face. This was the result of bullying Yongning. This was the result of bullying Yongning. Prince Jin, Li Han's forehead was full of cold sweat. He suddenly felt that he was very lucky. The numbers and symbols that he hated just now suddenly became very cute. Die. I want all of you to die. The king of Shu's face was covered in blood. He was so enraged that his eyes were about to pop out of their sockets. He pointed a trembling finger at Li Yi and enunciated each word clearly. He had never suffered such humiliation before. If he had only wanted to suppress and humiliate Li Yi after he ascended to the throne, now, he could only appease his anger by watching him die. Tilting his head to look at Princess Xiaoning, Li Yi finally smiled. This was the first time he smiled from the bottom of his heart in recent days. He was already feeling vexed about being involved in the affairs of the imperial court. Now that he had encountered this special day of the year, he felt lonely and empty. All sorts of emotions intertwined together. However, all the emotions that he had accumulated for a long time were vented the moment he heard the word, beautiful sheep, and the moment his fist landed on the king of Shu's face. Don't worry, you won't have this chance. Li Yi turned to look at him and shook his head seriously. The king of Shu only felt a fist growing larger in his eyes. Then, his vision turned black again, followed by intense pain. Stop. Mingsu, who followed closely behind, saw the king of Shu lying on the ground and Li Yi in a crazed state. Her expression changed drastically. She immediately reached out to grab Li Yi's shoulder. However, when Li Yi turned around and she saw his bloodshot eyes, her hand paused for a moment and she didn't touch him in the end. The ribs in Li Xian's mouth had long fallen to the ground. However, he only paused for a moment before he made up his mind. He kicked the king of Shu's butt and officially joined the fight. The inhumane scream soon attracted the attention of the court officials. When they followed the direction of the sound, they saw Li Xianzi, who they had seen in the morning, punching and kicking an unknown object lying on the ground. They were so shocked that their jaws almost dropped. In broad daylight, in front of the court officials, he dared to commit murder in the palace. He was simply lawless. Was His Majesty really muddle-headed? How could he hand over the position of Minister of War to such a person? Wait, who was the person beside Li Xianzi? It seemed to be Li Xian, the supervisor of Jiangyi province, the crown prince of Ning. The figure standing at the side watching the fight also looked a little familiar. It was Princess Royal. Although the face of the unknown object lying on the ground could not be seen clearly, the clothes and body shape seemed a little familiar. A princess, a crown prince, and a lord were actually putting on such a big show in the palace. The court officials suddenly felt as if there were 10,000 horses galloping in their hearts. Such a big commotion naturally could not escape the attention of the palace guards. Before the court officials could approach, a group of guards rushed over. They were about to draw their weapons, but after Emingzu gave them a cold stare, they just surrounded the place. Several people immediately went up to pull Li Yi and Li Xian away. Although fighting in the palace was a serious crime, one was the crown prince, and the other had a special status. No matter how bold the guard captain was, he did not dare to use violence against a superior of the Secret Intelligence Office. He did not know which unlucky guy had offended both of them at the same time. He was afraid that this beating would be in vain. This unlucky guy this was His Highness, the King of Shu. Looking at the guy lying on the ground who had fainted, the guard captain vaguely recognized a familiar face. He immediately gasped, and his heart was in his throat. Oh no, this matter has become serious. Quick, summon the imperial physician. The guard captain said hurriedly, then turned around and calmly ordered, arrest Li Xianzi and Crown Prince Li Xian. Looking at His Highness, who was in a terrible state, the guard captain knew that today's matter was no longer something that he could handle. Go and report to His Majesty. The palace guards were perceptive. Although their leader's order was to capture them, they only surrounded the two of them and did not make any rude movements. Why are you so nervous? We won't run away. Li Xian clapped his hands and said, curling his lips. When the unknown object was carried by two guards and rushed to the imperial physician, the officials who had left the court finally saw his full appearance. It's His Highness, the King of Shu. After seeing the object clearly, several officials immediately lost their balance and fell to the ground. The person that Li Xianzi and Crown Prince Li Xian just beat up was actually His Highness, the King of Shu. Thinking of the scene just now, the people thought to themselves, if it were not for his clothes and figure, even the imperial concubine would not have recognized him just by looking at his face. What followed was a monstrous uproar. Chapter 447. Just now, that was really the King of Shu. What a scandal. What a scandal. Assaulting a prince is outrageous. He's simply out of control. A fight in the palace, and the target was a prince with a very sensitive status and identity. This was the first time since the founding of the Jing Kingdom. Even during the reign of Emperor Taizu, such an atrocious incident had never happened in the palace. The officials who were close to the King of Shu were shocked and angry. All of them were filled with righteous indignation and wished they could hack Li Yi into pieces. In recent days, the king of Shu's reputation in the imperial court had declined. He had lost face in front of his majesty and even the officials. Now, he didn't care about the little face he had lost. He was beaten unconscious and carried away by the guards with his face covered with blood. How could he have any face left? Even if His Highness ascended the throne in the future, this incident would never be erased from the history books. Although the other officials were not so angry, they couldn't help thinking of the rumors about Li Xianzi and the king of Shu in recent days. Li Xianzi was so frightened by a few words from the king of Shu. Was he worried that the king of Shu would settle accounts with him after he ascended the throne? Nonsense. This was a bunch of nonsense. Was he as cowardly as the rumors said when he beat the king of Shu just now? Thinking of that madness and ruthlessness, they still felt a chill in their hearts. The king of Shu would probably never forget today's shadow for the rest of his life. Li Yi couldn't hear or see the uproar of the officials and the frightened eyes of the surrounding guards. The sound around him seemed to be isolated by an invisible barrier. Because of the large amount of exercise just now, his chest was slightly heaving up and down. However, he didn't have time to wipe the sweat on his forehead. His eyes passed over the palace guards surrounding him and fell on a small figure. When he saw that silly but extremely friendly little face, Li Yi felt joy and relief that he had never felt before. He smiled again. But it was this kind and warm smile that caused the surrounding guards to feel a chill in their hearts. Did he know what was waiting for him after beating the king of Shu to such a state? How could he still smile in this situation? This Li Xianzi must be crazy. In the Hall of Longevity, Emperor Jing had just taken his medicine and was lying on the soft mattress, preparing to rest for an hour before getting up to read the important memorials. The imperial physicians of the Imperial Physician Bureau had advised him many times not to overwork himself. Otherwise, his condition would worsen. Emperor Jing, who had never cared about this advice, finally realized that his body was not as good as it used to be after the previous incident. After just a short morning court session, he felt a little tired. He could only sigh inwardly and temporarily put all his worries to the back of his mind to rest. His Majesty has just fallen asleep. If there's anything, please wait until His Majesty wakes up. We really have an urgent matter. Please inform His Majesty. The eunuch guarding the door and the two palace guards were arguing over something. Shut up. Changda's figure had unknowingly floated to their side as he spoke coldly. Chief Steward Chang. The two guards hurriedly bowed. Changda looked at the two of them and said indifferently, "What happened? Speak." There were imperial guards in the palace, so what could happen? As long as the rebels did not invade the imperial city, nothing was more important than His Majesty's health. Seeing Chief Steward Chang speak, a guard immediately said, "Chief Steward Chang, County Magistrate Li Yi and Crown Prince Li Xian just beat up the King of Shu in the palace. The King of Shu was seriously injured and has been sent to the Imperial Physician Bureau. We have arrested County Magistrate Li and Crown Prince Li and are waiting for His Majesty's punishment." The indifference on Changda's face disappeared. He suddenly looked at the guard and said, "What did you say? Say it again." After His Majesty said, "If there's something, report to me. If there's nothing, dismiss the court session." It did not mean that the officials could go home and beat their children. Usually, after the court session ended, most of the officials had to return to their posts and continue their work. If there was nothing, they would hold a small meeting to convey the spirit of the morning court session to their subordinates and implement His Majesty's instructions, but today was different. Many officials in the 3 provinces, 6 ministries and 24 departments were not busy with their work. They gathered in 2s and 3s and whispered something. "Have you heard that the King of Shu was beaten up in the palace today?" A gossipy assistant minister from the Ministry of Work said mysteriously while pouring water. "What? No way. This is the Imperial Palace. How could the King of Shu?" Hearing this, the two leaders were shocked, and they immediately came over. The assistant minister looked around and did not see the minister. He immediately felt relieved and described what he had seen on the way down to the imperial court session with exaggerated details. For a moment, there were endless exclamations in the duty room. The officials who were further away also stopped what they were doing and looked at the assistant minister with puzzled and curious eyes. The imperial palace was the most heavily guarded place in the country. It had been peaceful for decades, just like the surface of a calm lake. There was rarely any big news. The calmer the lake was, the bigger the ripples would be when a huge stone was thrown into it. That was because the incident happened when hundreds of officials went down to the imperial court session. The miserable condition of the king of Shu was witnessed by countless people. A layer of ripples easily became layers of ripples. Have you heard that the king of Shu was beaten up in the imperial palace? It was Li Xianzi and Crown Prince Li Xian. They even dared to beat the king of Shu. They are really audacious. You all know about the matter between the king of Shu and Li Xianzi. It seems that the king of Shu forced Li Xianzi too much and drove him crazy. What's there to be afraid of? It's said that the king of Shu would have been beaten to death today if the imperial guards hadn't discovered it in time. No. I heard that the king of Shu and Crown Prince Li Xian had a quarrel and were beaten up by them. After all, everyone knows that the king of Shu has been plotting against the Wang family for a long time. Unexpectedly, Crown Prince Li Xian intervened at the critical moment. Today, they met in the imperial palace and started to fight. However, the king of Shu was not as skilled as them. I heard that he is still in the imperial physician's office and his life and death are unknown. Li Mingze, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel, stood at the door and coughed. Several officials who were whispering to each other turned around and their expressions changed. They immediately returned to their original positions and pretended to handle official business. Li Xianzi was the nephew of the assistant minister. This matter should not be mentioned here. A trace of deep worry flashed in Li Mingze's eyes. This time, Li Yi really made a big trouble. Not to mention him, except for the emperor, no one could intervene in this matter. This little guy has always been calm. Why is he so reckless this time? Outside the Hall of Diligent Government, several old generals gathered together. Seeing that Li Yi and Li Xian were taken in by the imperial guards, they frowned deeply. Fighting in the palace was a serious crime, let alone beating up a prince. However, this was different from the written law. It was up to the emperor to decide whether to be beheaded by 1,000 cuts or lightly beaten with a few planks of the board. Fortunately, according to their understanding of the emperor, it was impossible to behead him. Since the emperor valued him so much, he would definitely not punish him severely. Moreover, this matter also involved Crown Prince Li Xian, so it was even more difficult to punish him. However, hundreds of officials in the imperial court were present. Under the watchful eyes of so many people, the two of them had beaten the king of Shu so miserably. It was not easy to overlook this matter. The officials of the king of Shu and the imperial censor would not let go of this opportunity. The imperial censor and the imperial censor would not let go of this opportunity. The imperial consort was even more difficult to deal with. In short, this time, he was going to suffer some hardships. This day was a very ordinary day for the commoners in the capital. The only regret was that it was cloudy in the morning. They thought that there would be a heavy rain to dispel the summer heat. Unexpectedly, it cleared up before noon. It seemed that they would not be able to cool down for the next few days. However, the families of the officials and lords with a little bit of status were shaken by a certain news from the palace. Chapter 448. I would like to see how that Li Yi will escape this calamity. In the Duke of Chen residence, Chen Chong stepped into the residence with a smile on his face. This caused the servants and the residents to feel puzzled. Did the sun rise from the west today? The second master, who usually treated others with disdain, was actually smiling so happily. A few coughs came from a hall in front of them. Chen Qing, who had taken a leave of absence due to illness, walked out. Seeing the laughing Chen Chong, he asked in confusion, "What happened in court today for you to be so happy?" A moment later, after hearing Chen Chong describe what he had seen in the palace today, a hint of shock involuntarily appeared on Chen Qing's pale face. "Is this true?" "It's true, it can't be any more true. At that time, I was watching from afar. This is him seeking his own death, he can't blame us." Chen Chong laughed loudly and said, "I will immediately write a memorial of impeachment." Under the eyes of the public, all the officials saw it. This time, even His Majesty will not be able to protect him. At the corner of the corridor on the right, the prayer beads in the white-haired lady's hand were broken, and the beads fell to the ground. The same scene was happening in the homes of many officials. In an instant, innumerable impeachment memorials flew toward the imperial palace like snowflakes, and innumerable people's jaws dropped in shock. To the Wang family. In the Crown Prince's residence, the Crown Prince's consort, who had just received the news, paled. She hurriedly boarded a carriage and left the residence. In the Li residence, the old madam had an anxious expression. She immediately had the servants prepare the visiting cards and send them to the various noble families in the capital. In the Viscount's residence, the bruised Fong sat on the stone steps in front of the door, staring at the sky in a daze. With such an evil woman in the house, these days were truly unbearable. Suddenly, the sound of hooves came from the end of the road. Fong turned his head and saw a fast horse galloping in his direction. "Son-in-law has been a little unhappy these past few days," Xiaohuan murmured, her hand supporting her chin as she looked at the young mistress and second young mistress. There was a hint of worry on Rui's face. As the closest person to Li Yi, she could naturally notice the changes in Li Yi these days, but she didn't know what she could do. Mississippi Lu leaned against the table with her sword in her arms. There was no expression on her face. She frowned as she thought of the words and emotions that Li Yi said that she couldn't understand. "Young mistress, something bad has happened." Fong's panicked voice sounded outside the door, and the three women turned their heads at the same time. "Your Majesty, you must seek justice for Xian Heir." A woman in a palace dress grabbed Emperor Jing's arm and said through gritted teeth, "My poor son, he was almost beaten to death by him. That Li Yi must pay with his life. Also, that Li Xian, we can't let him off easily." The woman wearing the phoenix coronet slowly stood up. She looked at Imperial Consort Cui and said, "Sister, before this matter is fully investigated, you should calm down." "How can I calm down? How can I calm down? My son has become like that. How can Her Majesty want me to calm down?" Thinking of the miserable appearance of her son in the imperial physician's office, Imperial Consort Cui showed a fierce expression and said fiercely, "Don't talk." Emperor Jing waved his hand and asked the imperial physician, Lu Jimin, who had been standing by for a long time, "How is the King of Shu?" The imperial physician bowed and said, "Your Majesty, the King of Shu has a broken nose and 3 ribs. There are many bruises all over his body, but fortunately, his life is not in danger. I have already set the bones for the King of Shu. If he wants to recover, I'm afraid he will have to rest for a few months." Emperor Jing frowned. This matter was really beyond his expectation. Although Li Yi didn't seem to be steady at all, he was definitely not reckless. Why did he suddenly beat a prince in the palace? What kind of stimulation did he receive to make him lose his composure like this? "How is the investigation going?" Emperor Jing said faintly, and Changda's figure appeared in the palace like a ghost. "It's all clear." Changda nodded and waved his hand in the direction of the palace door. He said loudly, "Let them in." 2 eunuchs walked in with pale faces. They knelt on the ground and said loudly, "Your servants greet His Majesty, Her Majesty, an imperial consort." Emperor Jing waved his hand and said, "Get up. Tell me everything you saw just now. Don't hide anything." Even if His Majesty didn't say it, they didn't dare to hide anything. The 2 eunuchs immediately described everything that they had seen in detail, including the few words that the king of Shu had whispered to Emperor Jing on the way. They did not omit any of it. Hearing the 2 eunuchs say that the king of Shu first bullied Princess Yongning, imperial consort Chui's face changed. Then she flew into a rage and screamed, "Nonsense! Bullied Princess Yongning? How could Xian Er be such a person? How dare you all deceive His Majesty and this consort? Do you all not want your heads anymore?" The 2 eunuchs thought that imperial consort Chui didn't know what kind of person her son was. They looked up at Emperor Jing and hurriedly knelt on the ground. They said, "Your Majesty, Her Majesty, everything I said is true. If there is any falsehood, let me be struck by lightning and die a horrible death." Emperor Jing frowned and said, "Go on." The 2 eunuchs obeyed and told how the king of Shu bullied Princess Yongning and how Li Xianzi suddenly went crazy. They went forward to stop him and were knocked out by Li Xianzi. After that, they didn't know what happened. After listening to what happened, Changde was expressionless, but the eyes of the imperial physician, Lu Jimin, flashed a few times. The empress looked at imperial consort Chui and said coldly, "As an adult prince, he actually bullied a 6-year-old girl. Sister, you taught your son well." A trace of panic flashed across imperial consort Chui's face. She hurriedly said, "Even if Xian Er was wrong first, His Majesty should punish him. What kind of person is that Li Yi? He actually dared to offend his superior. He really deserves to die." Suddenly went crazy. Emperor Jing couldn't figure out why Li Yi suddenly went crazy. He had always been very accurate in judging people. He thought that he knew Li Yi very well, but he still couldn't figure it out. "Your Majesty, I have something to say." At this moment, a voice came from the side. Emperor Jing looked at the imperial physician, Lu Jimin, who stood out and nodded slightly to him. "Before that, may I ask them a question?" Lu Jimin pointed to the 2 eunuchs and said. Seeing Emperor Jing nod again, Lu Jimin looked at the 2 eunuchs and asked, "When did Li Xianzi go crazy?" "I remember that at that time, the king of Shu kicked Princess Yongning's doll into the lotus pond. The little princess cried and said, 'Give me back my beautiful sheep.' After hearing this, Li Xianzi suddenly went crazy. He punched the king of Shu's face, and then a eunuch recalled and said. The other eunuch nodded repeatedly, yes, Li Xianzi went crazy after hearing the little princess's words. The 2 described the details of the king of Shu's beating in detail. As for Li Xianzi's "go to hell," they wisely chose to hide it. Lu Jimin turned his head, bowed and said, "Your Majesty, I have finished my questions." Emperor Jing looked at him and said doubtfully, "Is this related to Li Xianzi's madness?" "Your Majesty is wise." Lu Jimin flattered Emperor Jing first and then said, "Your Majesty, according to my speculation, Li Xianzi should suffer from a rare hysteria. He usually does not show it, but if he is stimulated by some special things, he will immediately lose his mind and do some extremely crazy things. Your Majesty should know that Li Xianzi was seriously ill a few days ago. Your Majesty ordered me to go to the Viscount's mansion to treat Li Xianzi. At that time, I found some clues, but I was not sure. Now it seems that there should be something in the little princess's words that can stimulate Li Xianzi." "Beautiful sheep," Emperor Jing said in surprise. He could not help but think of the doll that Yongning often held in her hands. It was personally sewn by concubine Liang when she was alive. After concubine Liang passed away, Yongning would often see Yongning holding it. Of course, at that time, her temperament was not so eccentric. Ever since she had a serious illness at the age of 5, she became demented. She never opened her mouth to speak and only knew how to hold the doll in a daze. It was not until now that Emperor Jing knew that the doll was called Beautiful Sheep, and this word could stimulate Li Yi's sudden hysteria. Imperial concubine Cui suddenly realized that the topic of their discussion had deviated from the main topic. What they were discussing now was not whether Li Yi was hysterical or not, but how to seek justice for her son. Concubine Cui glared at Lu Jimin fiercely and said, "Your Majesty, he is exonerating Li Yi. How can there be such a disease in this world?" Lu Jimin said unhurriedly, "Although this disease is rare, there are many records in medical books. If your Majesty and concubine Liang doubt it, you can send someone to check it out." His expression was very indifferent, and there was no sign of guilt. As an imperial physician, even if he was talking nonsense, there was a theoretical basis. If she wanted to refute him on this point, concubine Liang was still too young. Emperor Jing thought for a moment and said, "Someone, go and bring that beautiful sheep to me." Changde waved his hand, and 2 guards immediately went out to carry out the order. Imperial concubine Cui anxiously said, "Your Majesty, even if Li Yi is suffering from hysteria, we can't let him off so easily. There's also that Li Xian. When did Xian offend him for him to be so heavy-handed?" Princess Yongla just watched from the side and didn't stop him. They are all targeting Xian. There must be some conspiracy behind this. Your Majesty must investigate this matter thoroughly." Emperor Jing glanced at concubine Cui. There was no conspiracy in this matter. Li Yi and Li Xian were simply wearing the same pair of pants. And Mingzu did not hesitate to deceive her father and count on them to help the king of Shu. Wasn't she hoping that the sun would rise from the west? "I will make a fair decision on this matter. The king of Shu will stay in the palace to recuperate these days. Send an imperial physician to accompany him. Concubine Cui, go back and wait first. The rest of you, follow me to the Hall of Diligent Government." Emperor Jing said lightly and walked out of the hall. The Hall of Diligent Government was the place where Emperor Jing usually reviewed memorials and dealt with state affairs. Li Yi and Li Xian were now locked up here. Li Xian walked back and forth in the hall with a worried expression on his face. He was not worried about what kind of punishment he would receive for beating up the king of Shu, but he was worried about Li Yi. Since he was locked up here, he had been leaning against the pillar and giggling alone. He never responded to him when he talked to him. He did not know if he was possessed by evil spirits or was suffering from hysteria. Hey, what's wrong with you?" Li Xian stretched out his palm and waved it in front of his eyes, but he still did not get any response. When he couldn't help but reach out and pinch him, there was finally a movement at the door. Li Xian looked back and hurried over. He said respectfully, "Li Xian greets your Majesty and your Highness." The Empress took his hand and looked him up and down. She asked with concern, "Xian, how are you? Are you hurt?" No. Li Xian said with some embarrassment. Emperor Jing glanced at him and asked, "Where is Li Yi?" Li Xian pointed to the pillar not far away awkwardly. Emperor Jing strode over. When he saw Li Yi's appearance, he could not help but be shocked. Was what Imperial Physician Lu said true? "Your Majesty, after seeing County Magistrate Li, I feel that my guess is almost right." Imperial Physician Lu thought that County Magistrate Li was indeed County Magistrate Li. His cooperation and acting skills were simply flawless. "Bold Li Yi, do you know your crime?" Emperor Jing looked at him and suddenly said coldly. Li Yi had a faint smile on his face. He seemed to be completely immersed in his own world and was not moved at all. The atmosphere in the hall was a little awkward for a while. Ahem. Emperor Jing coughed and his old face could not help but turn red. "Your Majesty, you can't wake County Magistrate Li like this. Lu Jimin hurried forward and stretched out his hands to slap in front of Li Yi's eyes. He said loudly, County Magistrate Li, what is a beautiful sheep? Li Yi's body shook violently. He looked up and saw Emperor Jing standing in front of him with a black face. He was shocked and said, Your Majesty, when did you come? Li Yi, do you know your crime? Emperor Jing looked at him and repeated what he had just said. We'll talk about this later. Li Yi showed a trace of excitement on his face and said, Your Majesty, I think I know how to cure Princess Yongning's illness. The corners of Changda's mouth twitched, and the expressions on the faces of several palace guards were quite interesting. In the whole palace, no, in the whole world, who dared to speak to His Majesty like this after being questioned in person? Who else but County Magistrate Li? Is this true? Emperor Jing's eyes flashed fiercely and his breathing became slightly rapid. Concubine Liang had a weak temperament and was his favorite concubine. Her early death was still a pain in his heart until now. Yongning's character was almost the same as concubine Liang's, so he was naturally very fond of Yongning. However, after a serious illness, she suffered from the illness of losing her soul. She did not even recognize him, the Emperor Father, which made him feel helpless and disappointed. If Li Yi could really cure her, as long as he did not commit the crime of rebellion and treason, so what if he was pardoned? What's more, this time he did not. Is what you said true? After all, he was the emperor of a country. When Emperor Jing spoke again, his tone had returned to calmness. However, the excitement in the depths of his eyes could not be concealed. Yes. Li Yi took a deep breath and said. Is he serious? Li Xian stood at the door of a palace and said with some uncertainty. If he said it's possible, then it should be possible. Li Emingsu looked at the closed door and said hesitantly. Emperor Jing sat in a curtain, which had long been propped up with a canopy. His eyes were also staring in front. Inside the hall, the little girl stood there blankly. Her eyes were empty as if she had lost her soul. She kept muttering, Beautiful sheep is gone, beautiful sheep is gone. Li Yi took a deep breath and forcibly suppressed the excitement in his heart. He squatted down and held her in his arms. He whispered, It doesn't matter if beautiful sheep is gone. We can make another one. What else does Yongning want? Pleasant sheep. Red wolf. Or little gray wolf. After saying this, Li Yi could clearly feel the little figure in his arms tremble. The soft murmurs disappeared. She looked up at Li Yi. Her wooden face finally showed some other expression. There was an inconceivable light in her big gem-like eyes. Gradually, her eyes filled with tears, as if she had been greatly wronged. Her body trembled uncontrollably, and her little mouth pouted. She hugged Li Yi tightly with all the strength in her body. Wah! Suddenly, there was a cry in the hall. It was heartbreaking and heart-wrenching. Chapter 449. I miss Daddy, I miss Mommy. Little E will take her medicine. Little E is not afraid of injections. Little E must live well. Daddy, Mommy, where are you? Little E is so scared alone. Do you not want Little E anymore? Little E, don't be afraid. Little E is not alone. Li Yi listened to the little girl's incessant murmuring. He used his hand to gently pat her back and said softly. Not long after, her murmuring gradually became softer. Looking at her clenched fists and furrowed brows in her sleep, Li Yi closed his eyes and this scene began to appear in his mind. In the depths of the dark and serene palace, a 5-year-old girl curled up in a corner. She did not know what had happened, nor did she know what had happened to this world. Perhaps when she woke up, her daddy and mommy who loved her were gone, and the only one who accompanied her was a doll by her side. Although it wasn't good-looking and couldn't be compared to her beautiful sheep doll, it was her only playmate at the moment. It was also her only spiritual sustenance. She missed her beautiful sheep very much, so she gave it such a name. Then, someone finally appeared. But she did not know those people. They walked in from the outside, wearing strange clothes and saying strange things. They called her Little Princess, that was what her daddy used to call her, but where did daddy go? It was not only her daddy and mommy who disappeared. Pleasant sheep, big wolf, beautiful sheep, and lazy sheep, where did they all go? She cried for her daddy and mommy. She wanted to leave this strange place, she wanted to go home, but the way those people looked at her slowly became strange. This made her very afraid. Every time she spoke, she would be looked at with a strange gaze. Then, she stopped talking. Princess Yongning, who had been seriously ill and had miraculously woken up, became the topic that the people of Jingdo took delight in talking about. Regretfully, although the little princess had managed to keep her life, she had contracted an illness that caused her to lose her soul. The clever and quick-witted little princess had become stupid. The heavens were truly unfair to her. In the following year, a silly little girl appeared on the stone steps of a certain palace in the palace. She held a doll in her arms and only stared blankly into the distance. She was a target that all the princes and princesses could bully at will. Perhaps it was because she hid in the dark and silent palace at night that her tears had run dry. She never cried when she was bullied by other princes and princesses, until the king of Shu destroyed her only hope. Li Yi tightened his arms and hugged her tightly. He couldn't imagine what kind of pain and torment a 5-year-old girl had suffered in this strange world for a year. He kissed her forehead with some pity. The little girl's fists gradually loosened and her brows relaxed. A smile appeared on Li Yi's face. He simply sat cross-legged on the ground and carefully let her lie in his arms. That's great, he thought to himself as he looked at the little girl in her sleep. At this moment, the feeling of loneliness that had never been extinguished in the depths of his heart completely disappeared. It's already midnight, why is it taking so long? Li Xian's face was full of anxiety as he paced outside the palace. His tone was a little anxious. Li Yi said that he had a way to cure Princess Yongning's illness, but the condition was that they needed a quiet place. Only he and Princess Yongning were there. Even Imperial Physician Lu's request to go in and help was rejected. However, it had already been several hours since he entered the palace. Even the palace gates were closed, but there was no movement from inside. Li Xian couldn't help but feel worried. He was worried that Li Yi couldn't cure Yongning's illness and made Imperial Uncle wait outside for so long. This was a crime of deceiving the emperor, and it was much more serious than beating up the king of Shu. Why don't I go in and take a look? Mingsu looked back at her father, who was still waiting there, and said with a frown. She had just taken 2 steps forward when a creaking sound suddenly rang out in the silent night. She looked in the direction of the sound and saw that the palace doors were slowly pushed open from the inside. 2 figures, one big and one small, walked out from inside. At this moment, Princess Royal Highness inexplicably had an illusion. The 2 figures who walked out holding hands seemed to be like this. Jing Di stood up from the chair, looked at the little girl, and slowly walked over. Yongning greets Imperial Father. Princess Yongning stood beside Li Yi, bowed to Jing Di, and said in a soft voice. Hiss, not far behind Jing Di, Imperial Physician Lu Jimin took a deep breath. Under the light, the little girl's intelligent eyes were as clear as water. Where was the slightest bit of foolishness? Li Xian was even more stunned on the spot. He actually did it. Was the little girl in front of him really the foolish Princess Yongning? A trace of joy flashed across Mingzhu's face, but Jing Di was even happier than her. The emperor's face finally showed a change of expression. How long had it been since he heard the word Imperial Father? Good, good, good. Jing Di said the word good 3 times in a row. He was obviously in a very good mood. Your Majesty, I only temporarily stabilized Princess Yongning's condition. If she wants to completely recover, she still needs a long time of treatment. Li Yi looked at Jing Di and said, no matter how long it takes, as long as Yongning's illness can be cured. If there is anything you need, you can just tell me. Jing Di lovingly touched Yongning's little face, then looked up at Li Yi and asked, do you know what happened today? Ahem. Before Li Yi could speak, Imperial Physician Lu Jimin suddenly coughed in a low voice. Li Yi touched his forehead with one hand and tried hard to recall for a while. He said, Your Majesty, I only remember seeing the King of Shu bullying Princess Yongning in the palace. Later, when I came back to my senses, I saw Your Majesty in the Hall of Diligent Government. Imperial Physician Lu Jimin came forward and said respectfully, Your Majesty, please rest assured. I have already thought of a treatment for County Magistrate Li's illness. I only need to go back and read the medical books to verify it. I believe that County Magistrate Li will soon be cured. Jing Di glanced at Li Yi and said, the palace is closed today. You should stay in the palace and leave tomorrow morning. Yongning's body has just improved. Take her to rest early. Jing Di ordered. The eunuchs and palace maids who served Yongning immediately came forward. The little girl looked at Li Yi with reluctance. Thinking of what he had just warned her, she gritted her teeth and left, looking back 3 times. Jing Di did not mention the matter of the King of Shu until he left. It seemed that he had completely forgotten about it. When Li Yi and Li Xian were taken to a side hall by the eunuchs to rest, they remembered that they did not have a chance to send a message to their families today. Rui and the others should be very worried now. Chapter 450. At midnight, the gates of the capital were tightly shut. Other than some special places in the city that still had their lights on, the entire capital was plunged into darkness and silence. In the Viscount's mansion, all the maids and servants were already asleep. The guards in the mansion were also not on patrol. 2 burly men stood at the door of a small courtyard, their expressions unusually serious. In a room in the courtyard, it was slightly crowded. The news has already spread throughout the capital. It shouldn't be false, since then, there has been no more news from the palace. I'm afraid that His Excellency has been kept in the palace. The palace is heavily guarded, and there are countless skilled fighters. It is impossible to force our way in. Right now, no one knows the situation in the palace. However, after tomorrow's morning court session, everything will be clear. As long as His Excellency leaves the palace, even if he is locked up in the Ministry of Justice's prison, it is not impossible for us to succeed. However, after rescuing His Excellency, we can no longer stay in the capital. We have to leave immediately. The water route is perfect. However, before that, we have to make some other arrangements. The thin middle-aged man thought for a moment and spoke again. Everything depends on tomorrow. Right now, there is no need to be too anxious. Although the King of Shu's status is extraordinary, this matter also involves the Crown Prince of King Ning. Even the current Emperor must consider King Ning. This matter will definitely be the focus of tomorrow's morning court session. What we need to do now is to wait my ass. We don't even know how His Excellency is doing in the palace. Fong slammed the table and said angrily. Lu Luo glanced at him and said, this matter is of great importance. If we are not careful, we will be doomed eternally. Brother Fong, please calm down first. Otherwise, not only will we not be able to rescue His Excellency, but we will also lose our lives in vain. Fong clenched his fists tightly and breathed heavily. The veins on his forehead bulged, but in the end, he did not speak again. Other than the brothers Lu Luo and Lu Mang, everyone else in the room was from the original willow leaf stockade that had moved to the capital with Lao Fong from Qing and Prefecture. Many of them were even more hot-tempered than Lao Fong, but the situation this time was unusual. Everyone was unusually quiet. Not long after, the door opened and everyone dispersed. Rui walked out of the courtyard and took 2 steps toward the courtyard next door. Suddenly, a voice came from the courtyard. "Ah, this old man has such a busy life. You all should go and rest. I'll take a nap and go there tomorrow morning to have a look." "Thank you, second uncle." Rui heaved a long sigh of relief. She closed the courtyard door and sat on a stone bench in the courtyard. Mississippi. Lu leaned against the stone table with her sword in her arms and said, "I'll wait at the palace gate tomorrow morning." Rui nodded. That was probably the place where she could get the news the fastest. Although she wanted to go there herself, if the situation changed, she needed to make more preparations. She had to think about their future from now on. Remember to stay calm when you're in trouble. Don't be reckless, she reminded. Mississippi Lu did not respond and walked back to her room. Xiao Huan stood at the door with panic and helplessness on her face. Rui walked over and hugged her gently. She whispered in her ear, "Don't worry. Everything will be fine. Now go to sleep." It was a silent night. No one knew what had happened in the mansion, but everyone felt strange. The maids and servants who had woken up early in the morning felt it the most. Second Miss went out before dawn. Madam and Miss Xiao Huan also left by car. Even the families outside the mansion did not open their doors. It seemed that there were a lot less people in the mansion. Especially when the sun rose, the old man had not moved the strange chair out to bask in the sun, which made the servants in the mansion even more confused. They thought that Lord Ju did not come back yesterday, and Madam went out early in the morning. So many people were not here. Did she bring people to catch? They thought of a possibility and immediately drove it out of their minds. This was the master's business. Not participating in the master's business was the first rule that servants in a big family should abide by. Today, the Viscount's mansion seemed to be more peaceful, but the court was in an uproar. The Qi Kingdom's redemption of the city and the Crown Prince gradually faded from the attention of the officials. Another matter was put on the desk. Emperor Jing glanced at the thick stack of memorials to impeach Li Yi, the county magistrate of Chang'an. He casually flipped through a few and lost interest. He said, "What do you think about this matter? Tell me." "Your Majesty, Li Yi, the Prince of Chang'an County, beat the Prince of the Imperial Palace under the watchful eyes of the public. This kind of behavior is too bad. If we don't punish him severely, where will the dignity of the royal family and your Majesty be?" A middle-aged official stood up and said righteously. This person was the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Rights. In addition to being in charge of education and diplomatic affairs, the Ministry of Rights was also responsible for maintaining everything related to the laws and regulations of the country. Of course, there was a more important reason why the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Rights stood out. His surname was Chen, and Marquis Chen's mansion had always been close to the King of Shu. When such a thing happened, he would definitely stand on the side of the King of Shu. Assistant Minister Chen is right. The county magistrate of Chang'an, Li Yi, offended his superior and seriously injured the King of Shu in front of the officials. He must be severely punished. Another official stood out and said, "Assistant Minister Chen and Lord Wu are right. The county magistrate of Chang'an must be severely punished." "I agree." As soon as he stood out, several more people agreed and seconded his opinion. The censors in the imperial court were very free today. The impeachment was actually their business, and the officials had always stood against them. However, today, all the officials were surprisingly unified. One after another, they rushed to express their opinions. They had no chance to speak at all. Of course, as the supervising censor, Li Xian was also one of the main characters in the fight. The censorate still cared about their reputation. If they didn't have to say anything today, they wouldn't say anything. If someone pointed out this matter, where would they hide their face? Today's matter was not like other debates about the crown prince or other matters, where the officials had different opinions and could not wait to fight. Today, everyone who stood out condemned the county magistrate of Chang'an, county magistrate Li Yi. The general meaning was that Li Yi was lawless and offended his superior. He had beaten up a prince in the palace in front of so many people. This was a vile act that had not happened in the past decades. The main culprit was Li Yi. If he did not kill him, the people would not be appeased. If he did not kill him, the people would not be appeased. In the process, they also emphasized the miserable state of the king of Shu. If the king of Shu had not been so seriously injured, they might have carried him here for everyone to see. They would definitely be able to gain enough allies. In contrast to these people, the old generals were all dozing off in the court. Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Personnel, Li Mingze, had a calm expression from beginning to end and did not say a word. At this moment, a young censor stood out. One of the officials of Prime Minister Qin, who was about to go up, stopped in his tracks. This censor, named Song Lang, had been appreciated by His Majesty a few days ago. His words would definitely carry more weight. Your Majesty, I impeach the supervisor of Jiangxi Province, Li Xian. As a censor, he did not fulfill his duty as a censor. He knowingly broke the law and beat up a prince together with the county magistrate of Chang'an. He should be punished with the same punishment. Your Majesty, please make a decision. After Song Lang finished speaking, he stood there quietly. The voices in the court suddenly became much quieter. Several officials of the censor felt their hearts skip a beat at the same time. They secretly cursed Song Lang in their hearts. How could this matter be mentioned in the court? Prince Ning only had one son. If he was really punished with the same punishment, it would not take long for the censor's office to be demolished. Wasn't Prime Minister Qin's position high enough? The officials of Prime Minister Qin's faction were usually arrogant enough in the court, right? But none of them mentioned the matter of Crown Prince Li Xian just now. It was not because they had forgotten, but because they did not dare to. Not only were the censors cursing Song Lang in their hearts, but the official who wanted to severely punish Li Yi also had a dark expression on his face. This rash young man was really touching the pot that shouldn't be boiled. Originally, everyone was well aware of this matter. But after he made such a fuss, it had to be put on the table. The Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Rights, who was the first to speak, braced himself again and said, "It is obvious to all that Li Yi, the county magistrate of Chang'an, is the culprit of this matter. Crown Prince Li Xian may have been bewitched by him. Moreover, he did not cause much harm to His Highness, the King of Shu." The young censor Song Lang's words caused a sudden change in the court. From wanting to convict Li Yi, the county magistrate of Chang'an, to wanting to exonerate Li Xian, the crown prince of Prince Ning, this made all the officials secretly despise him. A young official looked at the officials in the court who were intimidated by Ning Wang's power and were able to say such words that went against their will without blushing or panting. He sighed and was disappointed. So what if he was Ning Wang? Could he be more powerful than the emperor, more powerful than the laws of the country? Thinking of his 10 years of hard work and his lofty ideals of doing his best to serve the country, a trace of determination appeared on the young official's face. He strode forward and spoke his own voice. "I second the motion." Looking at the performance of countless officials in the court, Emperor Jing finally waved his hand. A eunuch took out a booklet from his sleeve and walked down. He handed it to Prime Minister Shen and Prime Minister Qin, who were standing in front of the officials and had not spoken a word. Since ancient times, the left was the most respected. Therefore, between the left and right prime ministers. Although Prime Minister Qin was the most powerful in the court, Prime Minister Shen's status was higher. Prime Minister Shen took the booklet and opened it with a puzzled look. After a while, his expression became a little strange and he handed the booklet to Prime Minister Qin. Seeing the expression on Prime Minister Shen's face, Prime Minister Qin could not help but have a bad premonition. He took the booklet and looked at it. After a while, when the booklet was handed out from Prime Minister Qin's hand, his expression also began to become a little ugly. As this booklet was circulated among the officials, the sound of exclamations and gasps could be heard in the hall. The officials all had different expressions. Gradually, the court became strangely quiet. Many officials looked at Prime Minister Qin and the officials who were close to the King of Shu. Although they did not say it explicitly, the meaning was self-evident. As an adult prince, he actually took the initiative to bully a young and stupid princess. When His Majesty was seriously ill, not only did he not stay in the palace to fulfill his filial duties, but he also held a banquet in his mansion. Thinking of the King of Shu's previous actions, Prime Minister Qin, tell me, what kind of person do you want to help ascend the throne? If someone with such a temperament became the emperor, many officials felt that their lives would be greatly threatened. This was only one point in the booklet. In addition, what about the intermittent hysteria of the Prince of Chang and County? This booklet was sent from His Majesty, so there was no doubt about its authenticity. With the testimony of the Imperial Physician Bureau, the illness of the Prince of Chang and County should not be fake. The Prince of Chang and County was actually suffering from hysteria. No one had ever known about this before. But in this way, the mystery in everyone's hearts was finally explained. No wonder he would do such a thing. Except for a lunatic, how could a normal person beat a prince in the palace in front of the civil and military officials? Li Xian had always been close to him. Could it be that he was infected by Li Xian? However, beating a prince was beating a prince. Hysteria was not a reason to beat a prince. Although the punishment could be reduced according to the circumstances, the King of Shu had been injured to such a degree. If it was lightly mentioned, how could the royal family save face? But, how could the silly Princess Yongning suddenly be cured by him? Everyone in the court knew about Princess Yongning's illness. A year ago, in order to cure Princess Yongning's soullessness, His Majesty ordered to search for famous doctors all over the world. He even promised a generous reward. The reward was so generous that anyone would be tempted. But unfortunately, even the Imperial Physician Bureau thought that the princess's illness was incurable. Countless famous doctors could not do anything about it. After a long time, the matter was left unsettled. But things in the world were so unexpected. The King of Shu was beaten, and Princess Yongning's terminal illness was cured. All of this was done by one person. Was it a reward or a punishment? Was it praise or scolding? The water had been muddled by the air of Prince Ning. Now it undoubtedly became complicated. In the court, no one dared to interrupt. The strange silence lasted for a long time. Emperor Jing waved his hand. An official took out the prepared imperial edict and began to read it. Li Yi yawned. When he opened his eyes, he saw a familiar old face. It was a very comfortable sleep. Li Yi sat up and tried to distance himself from Changda's old face. He said, "It's so early in the morning. Is there anything I can help you with, Chief Steward Chang?" "County Magistrate Li, it's time for you to leave the palace." Changda was expressionless and said lightly. A palace maid had already brought the toiletries. After washing up, Li Yi stepped out of the hole. There was a warm breeze outside and the sun was shining brightly. "How did you cure Princess Yongning?" Li Yi turned around and saw Changda standing in the hall looking at him. "Before I answer this question, can I ask Chief Steward Chang a question?" Li Yi crossed his arms and looked at him. "Speak," Changda said lightly. Do you know the Sunflower Manual? Li Yi looked at him and asked with great interest. When Li Yi walked briskly out of the palace, Changde, who was standing at the entrance of a palace and muttering the words, Sunflower Manual, seemed to feel something. He suddenly turned his head and looked in a certain direction. He looked at the empty hall. The confusion on his face lasted for a moment before he slowly withdrew his gaze. At the same time, the manager of the catering department looked at the rows of servants with a gloomy expression. He said angrily, "Speak. Who stole the white-cut chicken that His Highness Prince Jean asked for?" The people of a certain street in the capital were surprised to find that a smoothie shop that had been very popular recently was not open. They paced around the entrance for a moment before leaving with some regret. In the backyard of the shop, the woman in white had a calm expression. A few sturdy figures sat there and looked in the direction of the palace. The atmosphere was extremely tense. Chapter 451. The stone steps leading to the outside of the palace were very long. The guards at the palace gate were still expressionless. Their sharp eyes scanned the surroundings to prevent unrelated people from approaching. Li Yi walked out of the palace gate and looked back. At this moment, everything seemed to be normal, but also seemed to be different. It was not noon yet, but the sun was shining brightly and the temperature was just right. The woman standing under the willow tree with a sword in her arms was even more beautiful. Life was so beautiful, and Li Yi was in an extremely good mood. He strode over, opened his arms, and gave Mississippi Lu a big hug. Because he was too happy, he picked her up and spun her around. At the critical moment, he remembered that this was Mississippi Lu, not Xiao Huan or Yong Ning, so he did not dare to kiss her pretty face or forehead. Before she could react, Li Yi quickly put her down and then waved his hand. Go home. Looking at his back, Mississippi Lu gradually put down her arms that were holding the sword, as if she had put down something extremely heavy at the same time. A few hundred meters away from the palace gate, a man who was sitting under a big tree and chatting with a tea vendor turned his head to look, and a trace of joy appeared on his face. He stood up and quickly disappeared into the alley. Not long after, the people on a certain street were surprised to find that the smoothie shop that was tightly closed in the morning had actually opened for business. They hurriedly rushed to the door of the shop. A few days ago, the shop had released a few new products. Because there were too many people queuing every day, they had not tried it for several days. They could not miss it today. Today's morning court session did not last long. The officials walked out of the palace gate in twos and threes, with complicated expressions and different thoughts. Everyone was thinking about the content of the imperial edict from His Majesty just now. The Crown Prince of Chang and County, Li Yi, and the Crown Prince of Prince Ning, Li Xian, had beaten the prince in the imperial palace in front of all the civil and military officials of the imperial court. Their behavior was extremely abominable. Of course, they couldn't let it go lightly. As a result, Crown Prince Li Xian was stripped of his position as the supervising commissioner of Jiangxi province. He had to spend half a month in the Crown Prince's mansion to reflect on his mistakes and was not allowed to step out of the mansion. Although Li Yi, the county magistrate of Chang'an, had a sudden attack of hysteria, it was not the reason for him to seriously injure the king of Shu. However, since he miraculously cured Princess Yongning's terminal illness, His Majesty was very pleased. In the spirit of humanitarianism, His Majesty did not punish him severely. He was only stripped of his position as the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War and fined his salary for a year. It was not until the officials walked out of the hall that they realized when Li Yi, the county magistrate of Chang'an, became the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War. Although His Majesty had mentioned this matter in the court, it was immediately opposed by many officials. In the end, it was left unsettled. How could such a thing happen when there was no sign of anything happening? However, although this move seemed unreasonable, no one, including Prime Minister Qin, objected to it. Since they knew the whole story of yesterday's incident, they immediately understood that the King of Shu's beating was probably in vain. Now that things had developed to this point, it was no longer as simple as it was in the beginning. On the contrary, it had little to do with Crown Prince Li Xian and Crown Prince Li. His Majesty had always been strict with the princes, especially in terms of morality. As an adult prince, the King of Shu actually bullied a 6-year-old little princess. Although Princess Yongning was not the biological daughter of concubine Cui, she was his younger sister anyway. After knowing this matter, even they were extremely disappointed in the King of Shu, let alone His Majesty. If the King of Shu did not have the support of several rich and powerful families and the support of Prime Minister Qin in the court, he would not have had a chance to be the crown prince. As for the inheritance of the heir over the concubines, what was the ancestral system compared to the rise and fall of the country? This time, His Majesty had undoubtedly conveyed his attitude to the officials. After today, the officials who were firmly on the King of Shu's side would try their best to change the situation, while those who were still wavering on the sidelines would probably feel even more uneasy. But in any case, no one would mention making the King of Shu the crown prince in a short period of time. In a secluded hall in the palace, the King of Shu was lying on his back on the bed. His head was covered with white gauze and his eyes were fixed on the ceiling. You disappoint me so much. Concubine Cui stood in front of the bed, her face full of anger. She looked at the King of Shu and said, "Why did you provoke Yongning? Do you know how difficult it was for us to get to where we are today in order for you to become the crown prince and ascend the throne in the future?" The King of Shu's face was covered with white gauze, so his expression could not be seen at all. Only from his clenched fists and the deep hatred in his eyes could one tell his mood at the moment. He had just learned of what had happened in the court today. He wanted to cut Li Yi into pieces and eat his blood and flesh, but he was only fined a year's salary. To him, what could be more ironic than this? As a prince, he was beaten and seriously injured in front of everyone, and now he could only lie on the bed, unable to move. But the person who beat him up was not punished at all. How could he still have the face to stand in front of others in the future? He hated Li Yi, he hated Li Xian, and he also hated the person he should not hate. If he had given him the title of crown prince earlier, "You should recuperate here these days. I have already written to your uncle. They will help you think of a way. After you recover, you can go to Prime Minister Qin's residence." Lying on the bed, the King of Shu listened to concubine Cui's words. He loosened his clenched fists and took a deep breath. "I know." He gritted his teeth and squeezed these words out of his mouth. For many people, the King of Shu's loss of power was not something to be happy about. According to the officials in the Shangshu province, Prime Minister Qin had been sullen today. It was rare for him to reprimand an official for a small matter. All the officials in the Shangshu province felt insecure. In Duke Chen's residence, a servant girl lowered her head to clean up the broken teacup. She did not even dare to breathe loudly, let alone look up. Recalling the conversation between the two masters just now, the servant girl outside the door quietly left and trotted towards a small courtyard. The officials and nobles who were close to the King of Shu were naturally not in a good mood. However, there were also people who praised Li Xianzi in their hearts. After the few princes who were still in the capital who were about to come of age heard about what happened today, their minds finally became active. They originally thought that with their strength, it was impossible for them to compete with the King of Shu. However, what happened today had ignited a glimmer of hope in their hearts. Even if it was only a glimmer, no one was willing to give up. At the same time, there were also countless letters flying out of the capital. Their destination was the fiefdom of those princes who had come of age. In the crown prince's residence, Li Xian was having a headache dealing with the Wang family. In the viscount's residence, Li Yi was also humbly receiving lessons from the old mistress. The servant girls all felt that it was unfair for Lord Ju. Although they did not know what Lord Ju had done to make the old mistress so angry, their monthly allowance had been doubled by Lord Jew. Naturally, they would side with Lord Jew. The servant girls in the residence counted with her fingers how much double the monthly allowance was. They could get a lot more every month. If this continued, they would be able to renovate their house in no time. She did not dare to think about it anymore. The chicken that the old mistress wanted had not been cooked yet. She did not understand why the old mistress specifically told the chicken not to be chopped in vain. Obviously, chopping in vain was her best method. Chapter 452. Child, why did you provoke the King of Shu? The King of Shu belongs to the Li family. Do you think a mere viscount like you can provoke him? Madame Dowager sat on the chair and reprimanded him with a sullen face. You are now a dignitary in the capital city. You can't be impulsive. The lives of dozens of people in the Viscount's mansion are in your hands. Do you know how dangerous it is in the court today? If it weren't for His Majesty's wise judgment, who didn't favor the King of Shu and only removed you from your official position and grounded you at home for half a month, how could you be standing here now? Madame Dowager had always been kind, especially in front of Li Yi. She didn't even bear to say a harsh word to him. But today, she seemed to be really angry. After hearing that Li Yi had returned to the mansion, she rushed over from the Li family as soon as possible. She had been reprimanding him for almost an hour. At first, Li Yi could admit his mistake humbly and promised that he would never do it again. But later, he really didn't know what to say and could only listen with his head lowered. Of course, Madame Dowager was also very protective of him. After all, the King of Shu was a prince of a country. He represented the face of the royal family and had a very strong influence in the court. Normal people wouldn't provoke him. Moreover, what he had done could no longer be described as provoking. To be honest, it wasn't that he had nothing better to do. He just wanted to play with the King of Shu after eating and drinking. In the situation at that time, when he heard Princess Yongning's words, he felt as if his brain was about to explode. Blood rushed to his head. Not to mention the King of Shu, even if he was the crown prince, the emperor, or the heavenly king, he would probably dare to go up and beat him first. As for the result, at that time, how could he have the time to think about it? Madame Dowager, have a cup of tea. As old Furen reprimanded Lord Jew, the maids in the residence retreated. Rui walked in with a cup of tea and handed it to old Furen personally. The status of the King of Shu is so. Seeing Rui, Madame Dowager immediately smiled and changed the topic. Let's not talk about the King of Shu for the time being. Let's talk about you too. You've been married for so long, but Rui's belly hasn't moved at all. Your second uncle's child got married later than you did. Now Miss Shou's belly is bulging. Do you want to find some imperial physicians to take a good look at you? Just a moment ago, he was being reprimanded, and the next second, he was talking about children. The old man's change of topic was too sudden, and Li Yi couldn't keep up. Rui was taken aback for a moment and blushed. She handed the tea to old madam and hurriedly left. Old Furen put down the teacup and looked at Li Yi. This concerns the continuation of the family line. You must pay more attention to this matter. I will go talk to Rui again. Seeing old Furen leave the room, Li Yi sat on the chair. His legs were numb from standing for so long. He picked up the teacup and took a sip. His right index finger tapped unconsciously on the table. The King of Shu, the maids who were about to come in to clean the room saw Lord Ju's expression and thought that he was upset because old Furen had just reprimanded him, so she carefully left. Not long after, Rui walked in from outside. Seeing Li Yi's thoughtful expression, she didn't say anything. She just walked behind him, reached out her hand, and gently massaged his shoulder. Li Yi returned to his senses and stood up. Seeing the worry on her brows, he held her hand and said, "The matter of children cannot be rushed. Wife, you don't have to care about old Furen's words. Rui shook her head and said, it's not because of this matter. Li sighed and said, this time, I was indeed a little impulsive. Rui raised her head to look at him. Hubby is not an impulsive person. This concubine believes that hubby must have his reasons for doing so. This concubine only hopes that I can share some of the burden with hubby. Hubby knows that this concubine is also very powerful. Li fell silent. To him, in this world, there was nothing more important than the people in that small courtyard in the willow leaf stockade. He didn't want to bring in those irrelevant things from the outside world. They shouldn't have come into contact with these things. However, he seemed to have neglected the feelings of Rui and the others. Rui was obviously unhappy. Thinking of Mississippi Lu's hidden worry and Xiao Huan's red and swollen eyes, he patted Rui's hand and said, I'm sorry, it's my fault. I made you worry. Wife, don't you want to know what I'm going to do? I'll tell you now. Li looked at her and asked, about the king of Shu. Wife, how much do you know? Rui nodded and said, I heard everything old Furen said just now. The king of Shu is the eldest son of His Majesty and the prince most likely to inherit the throne. His mother is concubine Cui, and he has the support of several rich families led by the Cui family. He also has the support of Prime Minister Qin and countless officials in the court. Li nodded and said seriously, yes, the king of Shu is the most likely to sit on the throne among all the princes. What we need to do is to guard the Viscount mansion and live a good life. By the way, we can pull him down from that position. Rui raised her head abruptly and looked at Li Yi. Even she was shocked by what he said just now. Looking at her surprised expression, Li Yi couldn't help but laugh. He stretched out his index finger and tapped on her forehead, saying, I'm just joking, wife, don't take it seriously. Even His Majesty didn't punish me much, wife, so you don't have to worry. Li Yi comforted her as he moved the rocking chair out to bask in the sun. After a while, looking at the figure leisurely lying in the courtyard and teasing the little maid, Rui's eyes flashed with a trace of determination. She lowered her voice and said something. I know, Li Han, Monarch Jin, did not have a good time these days. Even though his teacher was grounded by his imperial father and could not come to the palace, and he had not seen him for a few days, every time he thought of how crazy he looked that day, even if it was in his dreams, Monarch Jin would be startled. Especially after he went to visit the king of Shu and thought that the reason why his teacher went crazy was because the king of Shu bullied Yongning, he had more nightmares at night. He saw it very clearly that day. The king of Shu didn't even touch Yongning, but she ended up in such a miserable state. Thinking about how he pulled Yongning's face, snatched her bestowment of ice, and said that she was a motherless child, the king of Shu's miserable state appeared in front of his eyes again. Monarch Jin shivered and quickened his steps to the hall of diligent government. He heard that Yongning was no longer stupid. She must still remember that he bullied her. He wanted to see his imperial father. He could not go to mathematics class anymore. He could not see his teacher anymore. Otherwise, when his teacher found out about those things, he would definitely be beaten to death. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.